_deviant_list. I awoke at my desk to the insistent scream of the telephone. Last night's final cigarette had burnt to a gray skeleton in the ashtray, and a nearly empty bottle of rye sat within arm's reach, a silent witness to my evening. The ringing did nothing for a hangover that felt like a localized thunderstorm behind my eyes. I snatched up the receiver. "Get over here. Shady Palms Motel." "Good morning to you, too," I rasped. It was Joe, a friend from my days with the LAPD. He didn't do small talk. "We have a stiff. It's Dan Johnson." Dan Johnson. He was a shit kicker from Oklahoma who'd come west to be the next big thing in cowboy pictures. Instead, he'd found a few bit parts at Republic Pictures and a whole lot of what Hollywood actually specializes in: booze, vice, and a morphine habit. He'd arrived in town spinning yarns about life on the cattle ranch, acting the real cowboy, but he was actually the son of a Tulsa dentist. The kid wouldn't have known cow shit from chocolate pie if you'd forced him to take a bite. The department knew him well, not for his acting, but for a rap sheet of public drunkenness that was getting longer than his filmography. I splashed some cold water on my face, grabbed my hat, and headed out. My DeSoto roared down the asphalt, the engine's heat competing with the morning sun. I had no trouble finding the Shady Palms. The black and whites and the press vultures were already circling the place like flies on a carcass. Inside the room, the air was thick with the copper tang of blood. Dan was lying naked on the bed. His throat had been opened nearly to the spine, a jagged, horrific grin beneath his chin. The mattress was a sodden, crimson sponge. As the coroners lifted him, his head snapped back at an impossible angle, revealing the true extent of the damage. This hadn't been a quick struggle. This was the deliberate work of a straight razor. He was damn near decapitated, a sloppy, brutal job. But who would want a never-was-cowboy star dead? I figured that was going to be my problem to solve. The Shady Palms was a $5 a night dump. What a guy like Johnson was doing here, even down on his luck, was a mystery. It was the kind of place where the roaches would steal your wallet if you didn't keep it under your pillow. There didn't look to have been much of a fight. If the used needles on the nightstand were any indication, he wouldn't have been able to put up a scrap even if he'd seen it coming. It explained why the neighbors hadn't heard a peep. "The maid found him," Joe said, stepping up beside me. "Mornin', Joe. Nice to see you, too." The maid was a blubbering mess in the corner, her face buried in a handkerchief. I gathered she'd never seen a man with his head halfway off. Lucky girl. Until today, anyway. "Why did you call me for this?" I asked. "Looks like a standard departmental headache." Order came from the top. I was just the messenger. "In case the chief forgot, I'm not on the force anymore." He saw to that personally. Joe sighed, lighting a cigarette. It wasn't an easy call for him. He had the mayor and the city council breathing down his neck after your incident. The incident was a call regarding a father who had beaten his 6-year-old son to death. The bastard had made some smart-ass remark when we arrived, and I hit him. Then I just kept hitting him. By the time they pulled me off him, my fist was thudding into a mass of bloody pulp. I was off the force before the paperwork even hit the desk. "We need you on this," Joe insisted. "We're still up to our necks in the Dahlia case. Besides, since you're not on the force, you don't have to play by the rules. Not that you ever did. A washed-up actor getting rubbed out isn't news in this town," I said, looking back at the bed. "Especially one who owed money to the outfit. It's no secret he was deep in the pocket of Giuseppe Pandolini. I'd bet Pandolini just came to collect. If Pandolini wanted to collect, he would have had the kid snatched. We'd be fishing him out of the Pacific a week from now, not finding him in a motel with a ruined throat." "Well, what's your lead?" "He was naked. Try some of the local clubs, see if he was spotted with anyone last night." "You think a woman did that?" I gestured to the gore. "You're the investigator." "Private investigator," I corrected. "As in, I don't work for the LAPD." "Don't be like that. We need the help. Isn't this better than tailing unfaithful husbands to cheap motels?" He had a point. The PI business wasn't nearly as glamorous as the movies made it out to be. "Fine. I'll take it. But I expect a paycheck. Just do what you do best, Jack. Find out who did this, any way you can." "You know I will." The hangover was still thumping, so I pulled into a diner near my office. I needed grease and caffeine to settle the riot in my stomach. I took my usual stool at the counter, and the waitress drifted over. "You look like hell," Rose said. "Rough morning." "You could say that. What'll it be today?" She didn't really need to ask. I ordered the same thing every morning my feet found their way in here. Ham, eggs, and a cup of coffee. From the looks of you, I should just bring the whole pot. Is it that bad? I hadn't bothered with a mirror. I rubbed the stubble on my jaw. I definitely could have used a shave. You look half dead, she remarked. Well, Rose, darling, I've already got one stiff on my hands today. I don't need to be the second. Some schmuck catch his wife with another man? I wish it were that simple. Some cowboy actor was found in a motel with his throat cut. Rose shook her head. You gotta love Hollywood. They all come here with stars in their eyes and leave with tags on their toes. I'd always thought Rose could have been an actress. She had the look, a hell of a figure, and a face that reminded me of and Sheridan. But she wouldn't have played the games the studio bosses like to play. If one of those sharks tried to corner Rose on a casting couch, he'd have walked away with a broken nose. She brought the plate and topped off my cup. The meal helped, enough to get me back to the office to hunt for some aspirin. Once inside, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. She was right. I looked like a train wreck. I showered, shaved, and threw on a fresh suit, trying to map out a starting point. The case of the dead cowboy scumbag wasn't going to solve itself. I fell into a nap that evening and woke up with a clear head. The hangover was finally gone. I knew the best place to start. It was a club owned by a former heavyweight boxer, a nice enough guy with a few too many dents in his skull. It was the kind of joint where stars, has-beens, and hopefuls all rubbed elbows. A place to see and be seen. The drinks flowed. The music was loud enough to drown out a confession, and the dance floor was packed. It wasn't really my scene anymore. I shouldered through the crowd and caught the bartender's eye. The evening papers had already hit the stands, splashing the murder across the front page in lurid detail. Everything shy of wringing out the bedsheets and printing the ink in blood. The bartender brought me a beer and anticipated the question. Hey, Jack. Long time no see. I can guess why you're here. Damn shame about the kid. Was he in last night? Yeah, he was here. Came in with Jimmy Sullivan. Jimmy Sullivan? Metro's new golden boy. That's the one. They rolled in around 7, drank like fish until 10, and then Sullivan's driver poured them both into the back of a brand new Chrysler. Any trouble between them? An argument? Them? No. They stumbled out of here arm in arm, singing at the top of their lungs. I could hear them over the band all the way from the curb. Anything else, Gus? I wish I could help you, pal, but that's all I saw. I took a pull of the beer, the cold liquid sitting heavy in my gut. I knew what this meant. I was going to have to talk to Eddie in the morning, and he was going to hate every second of it. The next morning, I drove to Culver City. I was headed to the Dream Factory, the land of Oz, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The guards at the gate knew me by name and waved the DeSoto through. The man I was going to see was Eddie Mannix. Louis B. Mayer might have been the name on the letterhead, but Eddie was the muscle. He was the fixer, a real headbreaker. When a star at Metro screwed up, Eddie made the problem vanish before the ink was dry on the morning editions. I'd done a few jobs for him in the past. One case I sort of remember was about Lily Rogers, a kid with a bright future who'd been caught in a blackmail squeeze over a stag film she'd done before signing with the studio. I tracked the extortionist down, and Eddie sent his boys to handle the rest. The extortionist got nothing, and the film was reduced to ash. MGM was a city unto itself. It had its own police force and fire department, so it was only natural it had its own enforcers. If someone got out of line, they might get a stern warning, or they might take a vacation to heal from a departmental beating. That was usually reserved for the extreme cases. I sat in the outer office, shooting the breeze with the secretary until the buzzer on her desk cut us short. Mr. Mannix will see you now. I walked into the office, shook the big man's hand, and took a seat. Jack, my boy, he said, his voice a low rumble. How may I help you? Eddie, I wish I were here under better circumstances. It's about the Johnson murder. Mannix leaned back, his eyes unreadable. Yeah, I read about that. But how does it concern Metro? The kid did some background work in a Gable Western years ago, but other than that, he'd been scraping the bottom of Poverty Row until even they stopped calling. The night before Dan met his end, he was out drinking with Jimmy Sullivan, I said. A bartender gave me the tip, but the place was packed. It's only a matter of time before the press smells it. That, my friend, concerns Metro. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Eddie picked up his phone and had his secretary locate Sullivan. He's on stage 4, Eddie said, hanging up. A romantic musical. How's his singing? Terrible. He couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but he looks good doing it. We'll dub a better voice over him in post. Come on. Eddie stood up. I'll go with you. They can break for lunch early, but we have to be quick. This picture is already bleeding money, and if you think I'm tough, you should see the bean counters in New York. We waited outside the stage doors until the filming in progress light flickered off. Even Eddie wouldn't risk ruining a take. Inside, they were filming a big-budget period piece set in some exotic foreign locale. One of those pictures where people burst into song for no reason. To each their own, but I never understood the appeal. I preferred the old backstage musicals where the singing actually happened on a stage. Better yet, give me a Cagney gangster flick any day. Eddie made the introductions. Jimmy, I'd like you to meet Detective Morgan. He has a few questions for you. Sullivan looked up, wiping stage sweat from his brow. What's this about, detective? I swear, Eddie, I've been behaving. It's about Dan Johnson, I said. I'm sure you've seen the papers. Sullivan's face paled under the heavy makeup. How could I not? You were seen with him the night he died. I want to know what happened between the time you left that club and the time the maid found him decapitated the next morning. We were both loaded, so things are a little hazy, Sullivan admitted, his voice shaking slightly. Nothing much happened. Dan was rambling about how his troubles were over, said he had something that was going to make him very rich. He never said what, just that I'd find out soon enough. We went straight to the motel from the club. My driver made sure he got into his room and then drove me home. I had to be in the makeup chair by 6. There was one other thing. He made a call from the club before we left. I assume it was to a woman. He was always talking about some blonde dish he'd been seeing. That's all I know. Thank you for your time, I said. As we walked off the stage, I turned to Eddie. What do you think? I don't know. Sullivan's been a headache lately. I'm afraid he's starting down Johnson's path. I've already had to bury a couple of drunken wrecks and a paternity suit for him. I'll ask my boys what they saw that night. We've been keeping an eye on him. What about the driver? He's on the payroll too. My offer still stands. You know, Jack. I could use a man like you on the permanent staff. The glamorous life? I smirked. And give up all this. It wasn't a bad offer. A private office at MGM, starlets in every hallway, and hopefully fewer corpses. I could do a lot worse. I'll let you know once this is settled, I said. Thanks, Eddie. I'll be in touch. I left Culver City with more questions than I'd started with. I headed to the station to see if Joe had turned up anything new. Joe Russo was hunched over his desk, a lucky strike dangling from his lip. He didn't even look up when I pulled up a chair. I'm here to confess, I said. I'm Jack the Ripper. Joe didn't blink. Call Scotland Yard. It's not my case, and I don't give a damn. Pleasant mood, I see. I've been dodging the press and the chief all day. It doesn't brighten the outlook. Anything turn up on Johnson? I'm looking at the autopsy now. He had enough morphine in him to kill a plow horse. The decapitation? That happened post-mortem. I frowned. If he was already dead, why bother cutting the throat? The report doesn't say. Joe paused, snubbing out his cigarette. He finally looked up with a strange, grim half-smile. But here's the interesting part. During the autopsy, they found a key, deep in his anal cavity. I stared at him for a beat. He had a key up his ass? Yep. Any idea what it's for? It's in evidence. We can have a look if you've got the stomach for it. I sure hope they wash the damn thing off first. We walked down to the evidence room. In a small cardboard box sat a key. It had been wrapped in bandaging and petroleum jelly, a bit of DIY medical prep to ease the insertion, I guessed. The bandage had been stripped away, revealing a key for a safe deposit box. Stamped into the head was the number, 1865. What do you make of it, Joe? Looks like your job just got complicated. Hit the local banks, see if they recognize the work. And when you find the box, I'll call you, I finished. I want to see what was so important the kid had to hide it in his backside. By the way, how are things on your end? Unpenetrated so far, I said. Thanks for asking. Joe managed a smirk. Very funny, Jack. I meant the investigation. A few leads. He was with an actor the night before, but the kid didn't have much to say. I've got someone following up on a mystery blonde Johnson called from the club. Did any witnesses see someone go into the room after he was dropped off? Still sorting through statements. I'll let you know. Right. Off to find a bank, then. That should be a breeze in this town. Joe grinned. You're Detective Jack Morgan. If anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's you. He put a little too much emphasis on the word bottom. Smartass. It had been a long day of dead ends, so I retreated to the office. I hung my hat and jacket on the rack and poured a glass of scotch. I sank into my favorite chair and clicked on the radio, dialing it until I found a station that wasn't selling soap or salvation. I pulled a Camel from the pack, struck a match, and filled my lungs with smoke. I knew I needed to quit the damn things, but today wasn't the day. I swirled the scotch, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight, and took a long drink. The warmth was a welcome change from the cold facts of the morning. Light music filled the room as I opened my book. My cat, Hammett, immediately jumped into my lap. He was a black runt I'd found shivering one winter morning, and he'd been my constant companion ever since. He was a bit of an asshole, but it takes one to know one. He made sure I couldn't read a single page without acknowledging his presence. After a shower, I fell into bed and slept like a man with a much cleaner conscience. The alarm rang the next morning with a violence that made me want to shoot it. Instead, I got up and started the hunt. I hit 7 banks across the city and came up empty every time. Bank number 8 was in Beverly Hills, a long way from the Shady Palms in every sense of the word. The clerk recognized the key immediately. "This was rented to a Mr. Daniel Johnson 3 days ago," she said, checking the ledger. I told her the truth, that Mr. Johnson had been murdered and I was conducting an investigation. Reluctantly, she led me to a private viewing room and returned with a long metal box numbered 1865. I pulled on a pair of gloves and used the key. The lock turned with a heavy, metallic click. I lifted the lid. The box didn't contain money or jewelry. All that was inside was a single manila envelope and a reel of 16mm film. I'd barely made it back to the office when a frantic pounding started at the door. I opened it to find a large man with a face full of fear. "Come quick," he wheezed. "Mr. Mannix needs you." I followed him down the stairs to the curb where Eddie Mannix was waiting in the back of a running car. "Get in, Jack," Eddie barked. No time to explain. I slid in, and the car screeched away before the door was even shut. "I just got a frantic call from Sullivan's housekeeper," Eddie said, his jaw tight. "I figured it might have something to do with your case." When we reached the mansion, the housekeeper was collapsed on the front steps, a blubbering wreck. She couldn't bring herself to go back inside. We soon found out why. The smell hit us first. Inside the bedroom, it wasn't hard to piece together the tragedy. Sullivan had placed the barrel of a 12-gauge shotgun under his chin and pulled the trigger. His head was nearly gone. The walls and ceiling were a macabre tapestry of blood, bone, and brain matter. He'd left a note on the nightstand. I picked it up before the first patrol car could arrive. I couldn't help my urges. "I am a sick man. It is better this way. God damn it," Eddie shouted, his face reddening. "Take that letter and don't let a soul see it. I'll draft a new one for the police to find. We can't have the press salivating over whatever urges or sickness Sullivan was talking about." This was the dark side of the fixer's trade. I didn't care for the tactic, but Eddie was right. The press would turn a suicide like this into a goddamn circus. "What do you think this was really about, Eddie?" I asked, looking at the ruin on the bed. "I couldn't say," he replied, sounding older than he had that morning. "I can control a lot of things at Metro. We can bury your scandals, change your name, give you a new face, and make you a star. But we can't save a man from his own demons." It must have been eating him alive. He still had a week of shooting left on the musical. "What are you going to do about the film?" "We'll use his double to finish the scenes. We did the same when Jean Harlow died." "That wasn't what I meant, Eddie." "Oh, this." He gestured to the room. "I'll make the call. We'll clean it up enough to make it look like he was depressed over some broad. The public eats up a lost love story. What about the burnt film in the wastebasket?" I pointed to the charred remains of a reel near the desk. Evidence he wanted gone, or maybe just home movies. I couldn't tell you. Eddie shook his head. "Just get that note out of here and figure out what it means. I'll have my man drive you back." Once back at the office, I called Joe. It was late, but I knew he'd be awake. Neither of us slept much. We'd served together and seen too many horrors to find easy rest. We were haunted by the same ghosts, the faces of boys who didn't make it home, crying out for their mothers in the mud. He never talked about it, and neither did I. When you've walked through hell with someone, the words aren't necessary. Instead, we'd talk about the Hollywood canteen. We'd remember the dances with movie stars and the meals served by famous faces. It was the last bit of light most of those boys saw before shipping out to a darkness they never returned from. I told Joe about Sullivan and the contents of the safety deposit box. I hadn't opened the envelope yet. I wanted a witness. He promised to secure a projector so we could see what was on the film Dan Johnson had died to hide. I fed Hammett and fixed myself a sandwich, my mind spinning over Sullivan's note. What kind of shame drives a man to a shotgun? Hammett meowed inquisitively, then curled into my lap, purring like a rusty engine. It's late, boy, I whispered. Let's try to get some shut-eye. He stretched, yawned, and followed me to bed. Sleep didn't come easy for me, but the cat didn't have a worry in the world. The next morning, after the usual ham and eggs at Rose's, I headed to the station. The building was swarmed with reporters. News of Sullivan's tragic death had hit the morning editions, and the vultures were circling for any scrap of gore they could find. I shouldered through the crowd to Joe's desk. "Mornin', Joe. What's the good news?" He looked up hollow-eyed. "Not only do we have a movie star with no brains, but this morning, William Westgate, president of First National Bank, took a 10-story dive off his own roof. The coroner is still scraping him off the sidewalk. He was clutching a rosary like a good Catholic boy. A note, just one for his wife, begging for forgiveness. I have the envelope and the film," I said, leaning in close. "You get that projector?" "In the back room," Joe said, standing up. "What's in the envelope?" "Let's find out together." We retreated to a cramped back room. I used my pocket knife to slit the manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list of names, each with an odd symbol pinned next to it. "What do you make of this?" Joe asked. "Jimmy Sullivan is on here," I said, scanning the rows. "And there he is, William Westgate. 2 names in 24 hours, Joe muttered. The list was a who's who of Los Angeles, studio heads, prominent businessmen, and high-ranking politicians. But there were no keys to the symbols. "We need to find out who Johnson was working for," I said. "This is a roadmap to a graveyard." We loaded the film reel onto the projector, threading the leader through the gears. Joe dimmed the lights. A blank white wall served as our screen. I clicked on the lamp. The image was grainy and dark. A young woman was tied to a chair. A man entered the frame, his face obscured, laying out a tray of medical tools, scalpels, razors, pliers. The girl was beautiful, with striking dark hair. It took a moment for the recognition to punch me in the gut. "Elizabeth Short," I whispered. "The Black Dahlia," Joe breathed. We watched in stunned, sickened silence. "The son of a bitch filmed it," Joe rasped. On the screen, the man began to carve a horrific smile into her face. I reached out and killed the power. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating darkness. Joe had been one of the first on the scene when she was found in that vacant lot, drained of blood and severed at the waist. "We have to find the monster who did this," Joe said, his voice trembling with rage. "Why film it?" I asked. "And how does it connect to that list?" "We get him, Jack. By any means necessary." "I was waiting for you to say that," I said. "It's the only way I know how to work." I made a photostat of the list and headed back to MGM. One name stood out. Fritz List, a German director who'd fled the Nazis to make a name for himself in Hollywood. He happened to be directing the very musical Sullivan had been starring in. I found List in Eddie's office. "Fritz," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I have a list of names from Dan Johnson's box. Jimmy Sullivan's name was on it. Now he's dead. What do you know about it?" "I know nothing of a list," he stammered. "What about a film?" The color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost. "If I say anything, I will never work in this town again." "Fuck you." I saw red. I pulled my Browning high power and pressed the cold steel of the barrel against his forehead. I thumbed back the hammer. The click echoed in the silent office. "If you don't want to go back to Germany in a pine box, you'll start talking," I growled. List broke. He started sobbing, and a dark stain of urine spread across his trousers, pooling on the floor. Okay. It's probably because I am a homosexual. I don't give a damn who you sleep with, Fritz. Your name is on a list associated with the murder of Elizabeth Short." "What?" He looked genuinely baffled. "I know nothing of that. I bought a film through Johnson, but it was nothing like that." "What was on it?" I pressed the gun harder into his skin. "It was pornographic. 2 men." He swallowed hard. "When they are finished, one has a movement on the other." "He shits on him?" I asked flatly. "If you must be crude, yes," List whispered. "It was not a standard stag film. I told Johnson what I wanted, and he had it custom-made. I paid $1,000 for it." He told me that for the right price, they could cater to any fantasy, any fetish. Is that all? I swear it. That is all I know. Go back to work, Fritz, I said, lowering the gun. And change your pants, I added as he scurried out. I looked at Eddie. Sorry about the floor. Not the first time, Eddie sighed. Won't be the last. It was late when I finally climbed the stairs to my office. I walked to my desk and reached for the lamp. Before my fingers touched the switch, a blinding explosion of pain shattered the back of my skull. The world went black before I hit the floor. I finally came to with a head that felt like a construction site and vision that refused to snap into focus. I was in a room I didn't recognize, sitting in a chair that felt far too sturdy for comfort. As the blur faded, I recognized the man sitting across from me. It was Giuseppe Pandolini, one of Los Angeles's most notorious crime bosses. He was a man I'd spent my career avoiding. Most people who earn a private audience with Pandolini don't live long enough to tell the papers about it. When he saw my eyes clear, he spoke. Did you enjoy your nap, Mr. Morgan? I can't say I did, Mr. Pandolini, I rasped. The room service leaves a lot to be desired. So you know who I am? Only what the papers print. Pandolini chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. You know how the papers are? A handful of half-truths and a heaping helping of bullshit. I have 2 questions, I said, trying to ignore the throbbing in my skull. What am I doing here, and who cracked me? I'll answer the second one first. My boys can be a bit overzealous. I turned my head, slowly, and saw them standing in the shadows. One was a handsome fellow covered in fresh scratches and bandages. The other was a giant with a face only a mother could love, and even that was a stretch. Handsome and Dogface both gave me wide, shit-eating grins. They could have just asked, I muttered. It's more fun this way, Dogface rumbled. Pandolini offered a thin smile. Would you have come along without a fight, Mr. Morgan? Depends on how nicely they asked. Pandolini leaned forward, the light catching the gold on his hand. The answer to your first question is the list. It's no secret the late Dan Johnson owed me a debt. That list was how he intended to repay me, and earn himself a little walking around money in the process. He paused to let that sink in. I know the police have the original. I also know you have a copy. That list contains the clients of a man who produces perverse films, a man I have a personal score to settle with. This individual introduced my niece to dope. She was a smart, beautiful, trusting girl. She was the future of my family, Jack. Our step toward a legitimate life. He got her hooked and forced her into his filth to pay for her habit. 2 weeks ago, she overdosed. He dumped her in an alley next to a pile of trash. My niece. I want him. I want him to suffer. Didn't Johnson send you the names? I asked. He was supposed to deliver them the day he was murdered. All he managed to get to me was a key, a piece of paper with symbols and their meanings. So the symbols on my list are the orders, I realized. And your key tells us what the sick bastards were buying. Exactly, detective. I want a copy of your list. In exchange, I'll give you a copy of the key. With the police, yourself, and my organization all hunting, the bastard will have nowhere to hide. He signaled for Handsome to take my papers to the back to be copied. As the man stepped into the light, I got a better look at his mangled face. What happened to you? I asked. I just wanted to pet him, Handsome grumbled. Pet who? Your damn cat. He's a mean bastard. I bent down to be friendly, and he latched onto my face like a lamprey, then vanished. I like animals, but I'm sticking to dogs from now on. I almost laughed, despite the headache. He is a bit of an asshole. When the papers were returned, Pandolini stood. I have to leave for Las Vegas in the morning to oversee a new casino project. I'll be gone 1 week. That gives you 7 days to find this man and do what you do before I do. We will burn this whole city to the ground to find him if we must. Our methods aren't all that different, I said. I know. That's why you're still breathing. One thing, I said. What would make a guy like Johnson work for a monster like this? Johnson was a morphine addict. This man was his supplier. But Dan had a skill most people didn't realize. He'd spent years on movie sets learning the technical side. He knew how to develop film. Since no legitimate lab would touch this filth, Johnson was their chemist. He developed the reels and used his old Poverty Row contacts to move the product. Why did he come to you? Conscience, Pandolini said. After my niece, and after whatever was on that reel in the bank box, he couldn't take it anymore. But he only dealt with a middleman. He couldn't give me the name at the top. What about the middleman? Pandolini's expression went cold. He was tough. He wouldn't say a word, no matter the encouragement we offered. After a few days, he wasn't in a position to say anything ever again. The Don checked his watch. I insist you stay for dinner. We have a pot of spaghetti on the stove. We can discuss the names afterward. I sat at a long table, my plate piled high with pasta and meatballs. Handsome and Dogface joined us, and the red wine flowed freely. I started to ask a question, but Pandolini raised a hand. I do not talk business at the dinner table. Enjoy the meal. After the plates were cleared, we moved to cigars and scotch. We laid the list and the key side by side. Jimmy Sullivan, I said, pointing to the first name. I checked the symbol against Pandolini's key. My stomach turned. It seems Sullivan liked them young. And the bank president? Westgate. Same as Sullivan, I muttered. Except he liked little boys. Sick bastards, Pandolini spat. The world is better without them. What are you going to do with this? I asked. Other than finding the supplier? There are influential men on this list, Jack. Men who would pay a fortune to keep this out of the papers. Men who can make my life very easy because I own their secrets. But this German fellow. Fritz List. What does this symbol mean? Johnson didn't have a translation for it. Old Fritz is into feces, I said. I've already had a run-in with him. That's disgusting. Handsome chimed in from the corner. By the time the scotch was gone, it was nearly dawn. Handsome and Dogface drove me back to my office. No hard feelings about the head, pal, Dogface said as I climbed out. Next time, just ask, I replied. Where's the fun in that? Handsome asked, touching the bandages on his cheek. Tell that cat of yours I said hi. I'll tell him you're a fan. Tell him he's lucky I don't shoot him, he grumbled as they drove off. Upstairs, I heard a low hiss from under my bed. It's just me, boy, I whispered. Hammett crawled out, meowing a greeting. You wouldn't believe the night I've had. The next morning, I was back at the counter in the diner. Rose looked as radiant as ever as she poured my coffee. The place was quiet for once. Do I even have to ask, Jack? I'm going to surprise you one of these days, Rose. But not today. Ham and eggs. She smiled and signaled the cook. When she came back, she leaned against the counter. How's the case? Complicated. Strange. I looked at her. Rose, can I ask you something? Why didn't you ever try for the movies? You've got the looks for it. You're smart. No accent. You'd be a shoo-in. She blushed, a soft pink touching her cheeks. Thank you for the compliment, Jack. Truly. I meant it. I've lived in this town my whole life, she said softly. The lights don't shine as bright for me. I like the pictures, but I don't want to be in them. When I worked at Union Station back in '39, I watched the girls get off the trains, farm girls from Nebraska with stars in their eyes. A year later, I'd see them get back on those same trains, broken. Like the life had been drained right out of them. It's not for me. I get it, I said. This town has a way of chewing people up. The cook slid my plate onto the window. As Rose set it down, I asked, were you ever married? Am I under investigation, detective? She teased. No. It's just, we've talked every morning for years, and I realized I don't know the first thing about you. I've never been married, she said, her voice dropping an octave. I was engaged once. High school sweetheart. He enlisted right after graduation, and we decided to wait until the war was over. He went to Europe. I went to the shipyards to weld. I was just getting home from a shift when the phone rang. It was his mother. I knew from the first breath she took. He wasn't coming home. There wasn't much to say to that. I just reached across and patted her hand. I've been on dates, she continued after a moment. But they either move too fast, or they can't tie their own laces. What about you? I don't see a ring on your finger. Never even came close. Trained for the force. Went to war, came back to the department, and now I'm here. Family life just never found a way in. Any girls? A few. Temporary companionship isn't hard to find in L.A., if that's all you want. But in my line of work, it's hard to let anyone close. Every cop's wife knows that any day could be the day she gets the knock on the door. We chatted until the breakfast rush started. I paid, left a generous tip, and stepped out into the sun. Despite the ticking clock on Pandolini's return, I decided my sanity needed a breather. I kept thinking about Rose. I realized I might have to ask her out for real. I can go toe-to-toe with the mob, but the mind of a woman is still the greatest mystery I've ever faced. I caught a matinee of Out of the Past. Mitchum was as cool as ever. Afterward, I had a beer at a local watering hole and played a few racks of pool. It felt good to be a normal person for a few hours. I got home, fed Hammett, who insisted on sharing my steak despite having just eaten his own, and listened to the Abbott and Costello show on the radio. Those guys always kill me. I sat in my chair, feet up, cigarette lit, and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. One day, I'd probably buy one of those television sets everyone was talking about, but the radio suited me just fine for now. My eyelids grew heavy. I turned the volume down low and let the music drift me off to sleep. I needed the rest. Because in the morning, the hunt for the monsters would begin in earnest. The telephone was ringing off the hook, a persistent, shrill drilling that finally breached my sleep. I groaned and swatted at the air. "It's time to get up, boy," I muttered to the cat. Hammett opened one eye, gave a long, judgmental yawn, and promptly went back to sleep. "Don't let me disturb you, sir," I told him. He didn't even twitch an ear. I fumbled for the receiver. "Hello. What the hell did you do, Jack?" The voice on the other end was sharp, caffeinated, and vibrating with tension. It was Joe. "You're going to have to be a bit more specific," I rasped, my voice still thick with sleep. "I take it you haven't read this morning's paper?" "Joe, I barely know it's morning. I haven't even had my first coffee or my first piss." "Put a clothespin on it," he snapped. "Alvin O'Day, the senator on your list. He announced early this morning that he's stepping down and moving his family abroad." 30 minutes later, every major press outlet in the city received a package. It was a dossier, evidence that the family values senator is a pedophile. We caught up to him at Union Station before he could skip town. When the boys cornered him, he pulled a revolver from his luggage and painted the station walls with his brains. The sleep vanished instantly. I sat up, the room spinning slightly. "Why do you think I had anything to do with it?" "Because I know you," Joe answered. "You've always taken a certain pleasure in dismantling politicians." "True enough. But I wasn't involved in this one, Joe. My schedule was a bit full." I told him about my dinner date with Giuseppe Pandolini. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "So, you're working for the mob now?" Joe asked, his tone dropping an octave. "No, I was persuaded into a mutual interest, just like I was persuaded to work with the department on this. Manpower is manpower, Joe. And Pandolini's men don't have to wait for a judge to sign a warrant. I don't like it, Jack. Sitting on a blackmail operation of this scale could bury both of us." "I'm aware. But if it finds the man who killed Elizabeth Short and turned Dan Johnson into a ghost, I'll take the risk." "Do you think Pandolini pulled the trigger on the senator?" Joe asked. "He's in Vegas for the week, but he left an army behind to mind the store. O'Day probably thought he could ignore the blackmail. He found out the hard way that Pandolini doesn't bluff. As for the suicide, O'Day knew he wouldn't survive an hour in general population. In prison, you can be a mass murderer and people will leave you alone. But you touch a child, and you're a dead man walking. He just took the shortcut." "Hard to argue with that," Joe admitted. "You coming in? I'll get dressed and head that way. You need a copy of this key I got from the Don. We can't let the mob do all the heavy lifting." By the time I reached the station, the press was swarming like locusts. I had to shoulder my way through the crowd, slipping in behind the chief while he was busy giving a polished statement about decisive police action. I headed straight for the break room, grabbed a lukewarm coffee, and claimed a donut. "Hey, put that back. Those are for real cops," a voice barked behind me. I didn't turn around. "Fuck you, Murphy." Murphy was a wise ass who had been too full of himself since the day he graduated from the academy. He stepped into view, grinning. "I could run you in for that, Morgan. You wouldn't go through the paperwork. Besides, if you shot me, they'd put you on this case, and you'd have it fumbled before lunch. Best to look the other way." I took a large, defiant bite. He flipped me the bird and kept walking. Joe was at his desk, buried under a mountain of reports. He looked up, his eyes landing on my breakfast. "How can you eat those goddamn things?" "They're a step up from the rations I was eating in the mud," I replied. "What's the word?" I dropped the copy of the key on his desk. He compared it to the list of names we already had. "I didn't have to shove this one up my ass for safekeeping," I added, though I did consider it for old time's sake. Joe offered a grim smile. "Very funny, Jack. Look, most of these names, possession of that material isn't a crime yet. But the ones we can hit, I'll get a team on. It won't be easy. These are affluent people with high-priced lawyers who can slime their way out of a hanging. That's where Pandolini's methods have the edge," I said. "A lawyer can stop a cop. A lawyer can't stop a man who wants justice for his niece." Just watch your back, Jack. Pandolini isn't a partner. He's a predator. I know exactly what he is, Joe. I don't plan on being his best friend, but having him on my flank beats having him at my throat. I returned to the office to find a Western Union messenger knocking on my door. I tipped him, took the telegram, and headed inside. Hammett met me at the door with a demanding meow. Finally decided to join the land of the living? I asked as I filled his bowl. I sat at my desk and tore open the envelope. I apologize for my actions the other day. Stop. I have information that may help your case. Stop. Meet me at the Pink Flamingo Club at 8 p.m. tonight. Stop. Fritz Lizt. The Pink Flamingo was a legendary lavender spot, a gay bar famous for its drag shows. The rumor mill said the mob owned it, but the clientele was high society, artists, celebrities, and the sophisticated crowd looking for a thrill. I'd never been, but in this town, there's a first time for everything. At 8 p.m., the Flamingo was in full swing. The band was tight, the drinks were stiff, and the stage was occupied by men transformed into pageant queens. I navigated the plumes of cigarette smoke and found Fritz List at a corner table. You wouldn't believe she's a 9-to-5 office clerk by day, would you? List said, his eyes fixed on the performer. You mean he, right? Not tonight, detective. Tonight, she's a star. He leaves the wife, the kids, and the mundane life in a locker and becomes what he was meant to be. Men have been playing these roles since Shakespeare. We're just better at the makeup now. They look like they're having the time of their lives, I said, sitting down. But I'm not here for the floor show, Fritz. I imagine my telegram was a surprise, Liz said, his voice dropping. Especially after I nearly fainted at the sight of your service revolver. It was. I don't want the tabloids to turn me into a monster, Jack. When I fled Berlin, the Nazis were rounding up people like me for the camps. In Hollywood, the studios keep us in the closet to protect the confirmed bachelor brand. I am what I am. One day, the world might be ready for that. Until then, I protect myself. I can understand that, I said. Everyone wants to live their life. So why the meeting? I remembered something. The Black Dahlia, Elizabeth. This club was one of the last places she was seen alive. She came here with friends to see the show. I think whoever is making these films uses spots like this to scout for talent or victims. It's a lead, I admitted. But this is Hollywood. Every street corner is a scouting session. I ordered a beer and watched the next act. Ironica Pond was announced. I didn't get it until the performer stepped out with a long blonde wig draped over one eye. Veronica Lake. I had to hand it to them. The joke was sharp. I feel underdressed, I told List. No worries, darling. We accept all kinds here. Even the flatfoots. List leaned in. I've been asking around. If I hear anything concrete, I'll have Eddie Mannix get word to you. I was about to finish my beer when Fritz suddenly stood up, waving frantically. Lily, darling, over here. My heart did a slow roll in my chest. Standing across the room was Lily Rogers. MGM had spent a fortune on her in the early 30s, voice coaches, dance instructors, even elocution lessons to scrub the Kentucky right out of her. They'd turned a farm girl into a goddess. But scandals and a difficult reputation had pushed her toward Poverty Row. She was a free agent now, working for the low-budget outfits like Monogram and Republic. She was still stunning. The 19-year-old ingenue was gone, replaced by a woman with a dangerous, heavy-lidded beauty. Her blonde hair fell like silk over a black sequin dress that caught every stray beam of light in the room. Detective, is this a raid? She asked, her voice like velvet and gravel. Mr. List's guest, I managed. I don't mean to interrupt your date. Fritz, she teased, sliding into a chair. Lily ordered a round of whiskeys. To Danny, she said, her eyes darkening. We downed the shots in silence. She talked with Fritz about the old days at Metro, her laughter cutting through the smoky air. When the band slowed down, she reached out and took my hand. You're going to dance with me, detective. She led me to the floor and pulled me flush against her. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral, and the faint scent of tobacco. She put her head on my chest, and for a moment, the case felt 1,000 miles away. I can't keep calling you detective, she whispered. What's the name? Jack. Jack Morgan. Well, Jack Morgan, forgive my frankness. It might be the bourbon talking, but I think you're handsome, and I'd very much like to fuck you tonight. I stopped mid-step. I looked down into those radiant blue eyes. You might feel differently when you wake up sober, Lily. You might take one look at me in the morning light and head for the nearest window. I highly doubt that. Maybe, I said, but I have a rule. I don't take advantage of beautiful women when they've been drinking. I'm not hard to find, though. I was lying through my teeth about the not taking advantage part, or at least, it was a hell of a struggle. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say yes. If you still feel that way tomorrow, I said, don't make any plans for at least 48 hours. She wrapped her arms around my neck and kissed me. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was a jolt of pure electricity that left my ears ringing. I took a cab home, which was for the best. I was drunk enough that the keyhole in my door kept moving on me. Inside, I headed straight for a cold shower, partly to sober up, partly to wash the scent of her off my skin so I wouldn't spend all night dreaming of things I couldn't have yet. I fell into bed, Hammett curling up against my side. The night could have ended in a haze of silk and whiskey, but I'd done the right thing. If I was finally going to be with the woman whose pinup had been in my locker since I was a kid, I wanted to be sober enough to remember every second of it. Lily Rogers was still dancing through my mind when I woke up. But the detective brain never sleeps. It just idles. I needed to know more about the girl behind the blue eyes, and in this town, all roads lead to Culver City. I got dressed, winced at the morning light, and drove to the gates of MGM. The regulars on the gate knew me, but today there was a new kid. He was one of those security guards who thought a clip-on tie and a clipboard made him a general. Do you have a pass? He asked, blocking the way. No, I said. I'm here to see Eddie Mannix. Name? Detective Jack Morgan. You're not on the list, and Mr. Mannix is busy. I can't let you in. He puffed his chest out, trying on a tough guy act that didn't quite fit. I leaned out the window and gave him a sly, tired smile. If you like your new job, kid, open the gate. Better yet, call Eddie's office and see if he wants to keep a detective waiting on the sidewalk. He made the call. By the time he hung up and turned back to me, his chest had deflated like a punctured tire. Sorry, Detective Morgan. Mr. Mannix said to come right up. I felt for the kid. He was just doing what he was trained to do, but he'd just learned the most important lesson in Hollywood. The fixer doesn't like to be kept waiting. Being chewed out by Eddie Mannix is like being savaged by a bulldog. You don't soon forget the teeth. I wasn't in the waiting room long before Eddie appeared. He buzzed his secretary, and she ushered me in. I could tell he was in a foul mood, so I decided to test the air. What's the word, Eddie? Tom and Jerry having a contract dispute. I wish it were that simple, Mannix grumbled, dropping into his chair. That mouse is a shark. No, we had another drunk driving incident last night. One of our stars nearly flattened an old lady on a sidewalk. Keeping the cops quiet is a phone call. Keeping Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper from smelling blood, that's a full-time job. Those two are real ball breakers. That's putting it lightly, I said. What do you need, Jack? I'm on a clock. I had a chance meeting with Lily Rogers last night. What can you tell me about her? Mannix leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he searched his memory. She arrived in 29. Fresh-faced, Kentucky dirt still under her fingernails. A scout saw her in an extras line and brought her in. We spent thousands on her, straightened her teeth, scrubbed the accent, taught her how to walk like a goddess. She was a star before her first real hit of theater. For years, she was a dream. On time, loved the press, the fans adored her. And then that stag film scandal broke. Eddie said, his voice dropping. We buried it, but it broke something in her. She started showing up late, staying out all night with the cokeheads and the jazz crowd. She stopped learning her lines. The board declined her option. Warner and Paramount didn't want the headache. Last I heard, she was drifting through Poverty Row, Republic, Monogram, the Laurent stuff. If I find out what broke her, I'll let you know, I said. Be careful, Jack. She's a wildcat. I'll take my chances. I've been scratched before. The drive back from Culver City was long, and it wasn't long before I realized I had company. A black sedan had taken every turn I had for the last 3 miles. I tried to shake them through the side streets, but they stayed glued to my tail. They knew exactly where I was heading. I pulled up in front of my office, and as I stepped out, the air was suddenly torn apart. Crack! A bullet grazed my shoulder, hot as a branding iron, and buried itself in the brickwork behind me. You're only going to find trouble, detective, a voice barked from the sedan's passenger window. Give it up, or the next one won't miss. The wheels screeched as they floored it. I didn't wait. I pulled my pistol and emptied the magazine into the retreating back window. One of the shots found its mark. The car veered wildly to the left, tires screaming, and slammed nose first into a telephone pole with a sickening crunch of metal. By the time I reached the wreck, the passenger door was swinging open. The gunman was gone, vanished into the alleys. The driver wasn't so lucky. My bullet had entered the back of his skull and exited through his left eye. He was slumped over the wheel, blood pooling on the floorboards like spilled ink. I checked the registration, but it was a dead end, stolen that morning from an old lady in Pasadena. Within minutes, the sirens were wailing. Joe arrived with the first wave of black and whites. I should have known if shots were fired in this zip code, you'd be the one holding the smoking gun, Joe said, looking at the wreck. I'm fine, Joe. Thanks for the concern. Oh, quit whining. It's just a graze, he said, peering at my shoulder. Yeah. Did you get the slug out of the wall? We did. A .38. Identify the driver. No, I said, looking at the man's ruined face. And he isn't exactly in a talkative mood. Someone's getting nervous, Joe. They're starting to take shots in broad daylight. We'll run his prints, Joe said. In the meantime, go get that wound cleaned. I just had this suit pressed. I don't want your blood on it. Oh, and another name for your list. Jim Duffy, the oil magnate's son. Found in his bathtub this morning. Took a razor to both wrists. What was his vice? According to the key, he liked films of women being beaten and raped. Seems his father's millions couldn't buy him a soul. Back in the office, I cleaned the graze. The bastard had barely parted the skin, but it throbbed with every heartbeat. I bandaged it up and sat in my chair, exhausted. Hammett was concerned, of course, mostly about whether my injury would delay his dinner. I fed him, turned on the radio, and lit a cigarette. He took a few bites, then jumped into my lap, purring like a small engine. All that fuss for a few bites? I asked. He just flopped onto his side and rubbed his head against my chin. Yeah, I love you too, you little monster. Just then, a heavy knock rattled the door. I slipped my shoes back on and kept my hand near my holster. Who the hell is it? I muttered. I opened the door, half hoping for Lily Rogers. Instead, I was staring at the mismatched pair of Handsome and Dogface. Morgan, Dogface said. The boss wants to see you. I offered a sly grin. See? Isn't this much more civilized than the head crack method? I preferred the old way, Handsome grumbled. My skull disagrees. Come in. They stepped inside, looking out of place among my dusty files. You boys are back from Vegas early, I noted. The issue out there wasn't hard to resolve, Dogface said. Hammett chose that moment to emerge from under the bed. He hissed at first, then cautiously approached to sniff the guests. Dogface reached down and gave him a quick scratch behind the ears. What is it doing? Handsome asked, looking down. In answer, Hammett gave a wet, convulsive heave and puked a massive, gray hairball directly onto Handsome's spit-shined shoe. God damn it, Handsome yelled. I still hate that cat. I don't think he's your biggest fan either. I laughed. Hammett walked away with his tail held high, the picture of feline pride. I can see why you like him, Morgan, Dogface chuckled. He's an asshole just like you. The only one not laughing was Handsome, who was frantically wiping his shoe. I just had these polished. I tossed him a quarter. Next one's on me and the cat. I'll kick that cat's head in. You try it, I said, my voice losing its humor. You kick my cat, and I'll cut your balls off and mail them back to the old country. Handsome puffed his chest out. Oh yeah, tough guy? Yeah. And deflate yourself, kid. You look like a tire about to blow, and nobody's impressed. Enough, Dogface interrupted. Mr. Pandolini is waiting. He has a surprise for you, detective. What kind of surprise? It wouldn't be a surprise if I told you. Come on. We headed down to a waiting Cadillac. Handsome got behind the wheel. I tapped Dogface on the shoulder. You let him drive? He might be short on brains, but he's the best wheelman I've ever seen. As we tore through the streets, I realized Dogface wasn't lying. Handsome drove like a man possessed, weaving through traffic with surgical precision. Where'd you learn to drive like this? I asked. Running hooch when I was 14, Handsome said, a rare note of pride in his voice. The coppers never got close. My uncle worked for Ford, and we spent the weekends tuning engines until we could outrun anything on the road. Best time of my life. The conversation died down as we pulled up to Pandolini's estate. Follow me, detective, Dogface said as we stepped inside. The boss is in the basement. He's been looking forward to this. He gave me a smile that I couldn't quite read. I kept my hand close to my side as we headed toward the stairs. In Pandolini's world, surprises usually involved a shallow grave. The air in the basement was thick, tasting of damp concrete and old copper. It was the kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin. It moved inside you. At the center of the room, bathed in the harsh glow of a single hanging bulb, was a man lashed to a heavy wooden chair. He was a mess. His shirt was torn, and his face was a map of purple welts and jagged cuts. This was the middleman, the bridge between the talent and the money. Pandolini stood in the shadows, his silhouette as still as a tombstone. He didn't look at me as I approached. He just nodded toward the man in the chair. "He's a man of few words, Jack," Pandolini said softly. "We've spent the last hour trying to expand his vocabulary." Handsome was leaning against a support beam, breathing hard, his knuckles split and raw. Dogface stood over the prisoner, a heavy leather blackjack dangling from his hand. I looked at the middleman. Even through the blood, his eyes were defiant. He looked at me and spat a red glob onto the floor. "Go to hell, Flatfoot. I've been there," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "The coffee's better than yours." "Give him another round," Pandolini commanded. The next few hours were a rhythmic nightmare. The sound of meat hitting meat, the heavy grunts of the men, and the stubborn silence of the prisoner. Handsome and Dogface worked like a well-oiled machine, trading off when their arms got tired. They weren't angry. They were professional. That made it worse. By 3 a.m., the middleman's head was lolling on his chest. His breathing was a wet, ragged whistle. Dogface grabbed a handful of his hair and yanked his head back. "Last chance, pal," Dogface rumbled. "Who's the man at the top? Who runs the lab?" The prisoner just gurgled. A faint, bloody smile touched his lips. He knew the rules. If he talked, he was dead. If he didn't, he might just live long enough for his boss to find a way out. Pandolini stepped into the light. He looked bored. "He thinks he's a martyr, Jack. He thinks his silence is a shield." The Don leaned down, his face inches from the prisoner's. "You have a wife, don't you? Martha. She works at the bakery on 4th. And 2 beautiful daughters. Sarah is 6, isn't she? Little Emily just turned 4. The prisoner froze. The defiance in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp terror. "They're sleeping right now," Pandolini continued, his voice as gentle as a lullaby. "Dreaming of dolls and candy. It would be a shame if they never woke up. It would be a shame if I sent my boys over there to vacate the premises." You wouldn't," the man rasped, his voice breaking. "I'm a man who lost his niece to the filth you sell," Pandolini said, his eyes turning to ice. "I would burn the world to ash to see the man responsible. Your family is just a handful of kindling." Pandolini looked at Handsome. "Go get the car. Bring the kerosene." "Wait," the man screamed. The sound tore through the basement like a jagged blade. He began to sob, the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sound that only comes when a man realizes he's lost everything. "The name?" Pandolini demanded. The middleman's head slumped. The fight was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than the beatings. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and then looked at the floor. "I don't know his name," he whispered. "He stays in the dark. He uses a front." "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. "Who was the front?" The man took a shuddering breath, a tear tracing a path through the dried blood on his cheek. "Ask Lily," he said. The name hit me harder than any bullet. My shoulder throbbed, a sudden, hot reminder of the shootout. The image of those radiant blue eyes and the smell of her floral perfume flashed through my mind, now tainted by the stench of the basement. "Lily who?" Dogface barked, stepping forward. "Rogers," the man choked out. "Lily Rogers. She's the one who brings the girls. She's the one who makes sure they stay quiet." I felt the floor drop out from under me. The wildcat Mannix had warned me about wasn't just a falling star. She was the bait. Pandolini turned to me, his expression unreadable. "It seems your lady friend has some explaining to do, Jack." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just turned and headed for the stairs, my boots ringing out on the concrete like a funeral march. I needed to find her. I needed to look into those blue eyes one more time, and this time, I wouldn't be looking for a dance. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my hand gripping the cold iron railing. The sound of the middleman's sobbing echoed off the damp walls, a wet, pathetic noise that grated against my nerves like a dull saw. I stopped. I didn't like the sound. It was the sound of a man who had helped destroy lives, now begging for the one thing he hadn't given his victims: mercy. I turned around and walked back across the concrete floor. Pandolini's eyes followed me, sharp and curious. I didn't say a word. I pulled my pistol from the holster, leveled it at the center of the man's forehead, and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small space. The sobbing stopped instantly. The man's head snapped back, and then the room was silent, save for the ringing in my ears and the smell of cordite. Pandolini looked at the corpse, then back at me. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders vanished. I had just crossed a line, and in his world, that was the only way to earn a seat at the table. He was starting to give me a headache, I said, holstering the weapon. I appreciate a man who values peace and quiet, Pandolini replied. He gestured to his men. Handsome, Dogface, take the detective home. He's had a long night. The ride back was quiet until we reached my door. The two of them followed me up, ostensibly to ensure my safety, but I knew they just wanted to see if I'd crack after the execution. We stepped inside, and I didn't even have the lights on before the trouble started. Watch your step, I warned. Too late. Handsome let out a yelp that would have embarrassed a soprano. I flipped the switch just in time to see Hammett clamped on a Handsome's calf, all four paws wrapped around his shin like he was climbing a tree. Get it off. Get this furry landmine off me, Handsome hissed, trying to shake his leg without losing his balance. He likes you, Handsome, Dogface chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. He's just giving you a goodbye hug. He's using his claws. Hammett, let go, I commanded. The cat gave one final, defiant squeeze before dropping to the floor and trotting over to his food bowl as if nothing had happened. Handsome was panting, looking down at his shredded trousers. I'm telling you, Morgan, one of these days, it's me or the cat. My money's on the cat, I said. Dogface stepped forward, his expression turning serious. The boss wanted us to tell you something, Jack. After what happened downstairs, he has a lot of respect for you. Most men talk a big game. You play it. Tell him I'm just a man who hates a noisy room, I replied. They left, their footsteps heavy in the hallway. I sat at my desk, the silence of the office feeling heavier than the basement. I reached for a cigarette, but before I could strike the match, a soft knock came at the door. I didn't reach for the handle. I reached for my gun. Who is it? Western Union, sir. Telegram for Detective Morgan. I opened the door an inch, took the envelope, and tipped the kid. No return address. Just a single strip of yellow paper with 5 words that felt like a cold breeze on my neck. Back OFF. Or die. I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. Get in line, I muttered to the empty room. I wasn't hungry. After the smell of the basement and the sight of the middleman's brains on the floor, the idea of food should have made me sick. But my body was running on fumes, and I knew I wouldn't sleep. I needed to move. I walked into the diner as the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. Rose looked up, her smile ready, but it faltered when she saw my face. Jack, you look like you've been through a meat grinder. Close enough, Rose. Give me the steak and eggs. Medium rare. She blinked. Steak? At 5 in the morning? Who are you, and what have you done with Jack Morgan? Just a change of pace, I said, sliding into the stool. When the plate arrived, the steak was perfectly pink in the center. As the red juices ran into the yellow of the eggs, I found myself staring at it. It looked too much like the basement floor. I picked up the knife and began to eat, slowly, mechanically. Every bite felt like a chore. Rose leaned on the counter, watching me. She didn't have her usual spark. You're quiet today, Jack. Even for you. What's going on in that head of yours? I looked at her, really looked at her. She was the only clean thing left in this town, and for a second, I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her about the list, the senator, and the girl I thought was a star who turned out to be a monster. Instead, I just took a sip of my coffee and looked out the window at the waking city. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Rose. Try me, she said softly. Maybe another time, I replied. Right now, I've got a date with a wildcat, and I think I'm going to need more than a bandage this time. I didn't head for Lily's apartment. I wasn't ready to look into those blue eyes. Not until I had more than a dying man's confession to back me up. Instead, I drove back to Culver City. Eddie Mannix was my only bridge to her past, and I needed to know who held her leash now. You again, Mannix said when I walked in. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Roosevelt administration. I told you what I know, Jack. I need her manager, Eddie. The guy who keeps her in B-movies and gin. Mannix scrawled a name on a scrap of paper. Bernie the Lip Solomon. He's a vulture, Jack. Even for this town. He operates out of a hole in the wall near MacArthur Park. Solomon was exactly what I expected. His office smelled of stale cigars and desperation. He was a slimy, fast-talking character with a cheap suit and a wandering eye. Lily? She's a star kid. A diamond in the rough. Solomon barked, leaning back until his chair groaned. Why's a flatfoot like you want her address? You looking for an autograph or a subpoena? I'm looking for a friend, I said, sliding a 20 across the desk. The 20 vanished into his pocket like it had wings. He scribbled an address in West Hollywood. Don't tell her I gave it to you. She's got a temper like a triggered mousetrap. I spent the next day as a ghost. She left her apartment at 9 a.m. For a woman accused of running a recruitment ring, she had a remarkably mundane schedule. I followed her tan Cadillac to a hair appointment on Sunset, then to a grocery store where she spent 20 minutes picking out oranges. She hit a casting office at Gower Gulch, likely looking for Poverty Row, work to keep the lights on. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a woman trying to survive a town that had forgotten her name. Yet, I noticed one oddity. As she left Republic Pictures, she handed a small, folded slip of paper to a man lighting a cigarette by the gate. No words, just a handoff as smooth as a card trick. Around 3 p.m., she pulled back into the Republic lot. I pulled my DeSoto across the street, settled low in the seat, and lit a cigarette. I was so focused on the girl that I forgot the first rule of tailing. Always check your own six. The back door of my car clicked open. Before I could reach for the ignition, the cold, unmistakable ring of a gun barrel pressed firmly against the base of my skull. Don't reach for the heater, detective. A low, gravelly voice rumbled. And don't look back. Just put both hands on the wheel and start driving. We're going to take a little trip. The smell of cheap cologne and gun oil filled the car. I did as I was told. As I pulled away from the curb, I saw Lily disappear through the studio doors. I had a feeling that if I didn't play this right, I'd never see those blue eyes again. The ride was silent, save for the clicking of the indicator. I knew these streets like the back of my hand, and I realized we were circling the hills near the Pandolini estate. I saw my opening, a sharp, banked curve leading toward the private drive. I didn't telegraph it. I just yanked the wheel hard to the right. The tires shrieked, and the weight of the car shifted violently. The gunman, caught off guard, went flying toward the passenger's side, his head cracking against the window frame. The pistol slipped from his grip, clattering onto the front floorboard near my boots. He lunged forward, blood already slick on his brow. I threw a sharp, jagged elbow back over the seat, catching him square on the bridge of his nose. The crunch was audible, a wet, sickening snap. He howled, clutching his face, blinded by the sudden explosion of pain. He didn't see the iron gates swinging open. He didn't see the gravel flying as I slammed the DeSoto into park in front of the Pandolini mansion. Handsome and Dogface were already there, stepping off the porch. Back so soon? Dogface asked, a half-smile playing on his face. I have a present for you, boys, I said, breathing hard as I kicked the back door open. The gunman rolled out onto the gravel, still groaning and clutching his ruined nose. Handsome looked down at the mess on my back seat. He doesn't look like much of a gift. He's got a lot to say, I said, looking toward the cellar door. He just doesn't know it yet. The basement felt colder this time. This new guest didn't have the stomach for the long haul. One look at dog-faced leather blackjack and the dark stain on the floor was enough to turn his spine to jelly. It was just a job. That's all, he shrieked through his broken nose. A job for who? I asked, leaning against the damp wall. Solomon. Bernie the Lip Solomon, he choked out. He said you were getting too close to the Rogers girl. He paid me $500 to put a pill in your head and dump the car in the canyon. Handsome looked at me. We doing the noisy room treatment again, Jack? No, I said. Throw him out. But give him a message for Bernie first. I stepped into the light so he could see my eyes. Tell the Lip that the next person he sends after me ends up in the fucking morgue. I stopped at a gas station to scrub the copper smell of the basement off my hands, but the psychological grit wouldn't wash away. By the time I reached the station, the air felt heavy with a different kind of rot. I sat across from Joe, giving him the edited version of the day, leaving out the part where I delivered a man to a mobster's cellar. Joe looked like he'd aged 5 years in 24 hours. He rubbed his temples, staring at a stack of files. "We're making the arrests, Jack," Joe said, his voice weary. "But every time we kick a door down, we find something worse. It's a goddamn labyrinth." "How bad?" "Worse than we imagined," he replied, sliding a folder toward me. "It's not just oil heirs and senators. We've got actors, priests running filth in church basements, and even a few names from the department. The ring runs so deep, I don't know who's holding the leash anymore." The mention of the department made my stomach turn. I stood up and adjusted my hat. "Joe, do me a favor. Pull the old file from the Lily Rogers extortion case. The one from back in the 30s. Joe paused, his hand hovering over a drawer. He looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The Rogers girl? That's ancient history, Jack. Mannix buried that deeper than a mob hit. Why do you want to dig that up now?" I thought about the way she'd handed off that note at the studio and the kiss she'd given me at the Pink Flamingo. "Just a hunch," I said. The fluorescent lights of the station hummed with a headache-inducing buzz as the clock ticked past 4 a.m. I sat huddled over the Lily Rogers extortion file from 32, my eyes stinging from the cheap tobacco and the grit of too many hours awake. Joe was right. Mannix had done a surgical job on this one. The reports were thin, the witness statements were missing, and the names had been redacted until the pages looked like a crossword puzzle. "Told you," Joe said, leaning against the doorframe with a cardboard cup of lukewarm coffee. "It's a ghost file, Jack. Eddie didn't just bury the scandal. He salted the earth so nothing would ever grow back." I tossed the folder onto the desk. "He kept the real dirt, Joe. Mannix doesn't throw anything away. If I want the truth about Lily, I'm going to have to get into his private files. He's the only one who knows who was pulling the strings before the studio cleaned her up." The sun began to bleed through the grime-streaked windows of the precinct, turning the smoke-filled air a dull, sickly orange. Joe looked at me and sighed. "You look like hell, and I don't feel much better. Let's get some breakfast, then hit the sack for a few hours. You've been running for 2 days straight, and frankly, I'm tired of looking at you. And I need to check on Hammett," I muttered, rubbing my face. "He's probably filed a missing persons report by now." We took my DeSoto over to the diner. I figured introducing Joe to Rose would be a nice, normal thing to do. It was a mistake. "Rose, this is Detective Joe Russo." "Joe, this is Rose, the only reason I haven't starved to death yet," I said as we slid onto the stools. Rose wiped the counter, her eyes dancing between us. "So, this is the partner? The one who lets you walk around looking like a discarded laundry bag?" Joe grinned, leaning in. "Actually, Rose, I try to tell him, but he's got a head like a cinder block. You should see his office. It's a miracle the cat hasn't staged a coup." "Oh, I believe it," Rose laughed, pouring the coffee. "He comes in here acting all mysterious, but I know he's just one bad day away from being a professional cat lady." I groaned, staring into my black coffee. "This is great. My two favorite people, teaming up to dismantle my dignity before 7 a.m. "It's a public service, Jack," Joe said, reaching for the sugar. After a breakfast of grease and mockery, Joe headed for his own place, and I steered the car back toward the office. My shoulder was a dull throb, and my brain felt like it was wrapped in wet wool. I let myself in, and for once, Hammett didn't aim for my shins. He just watched me from the top of the filing cabinet with a judgmental squint. I kicked off my shoes, checked his water, and collapsed onto the bed without even pulling back the covers. A second later, I felt the familiar weight of the little monster jumping onto the mattress. He circled 3 times, then curled up against my ribs. His purring started up, a steady, rhythmic rumble that acted like a lullaby, drowning out the sounds of the city and the ghosts of the basement. For a few hours, the Deviant List didn't exist. There was just the cat, the silence, and the heavy, dreamless sleep of a man who knew the storm was coming. The purring stopped, replaced by the jarring, shrill ring of the telephone on the nightstand. I reached for it with a groan, my hand fumbling in the dark until I caught the receiver. "Yeah. We have another stiff, Jack." Joe's voice was tight, stripped of the humor he'd had at the diner. "Joe, it's barely noon. What does that have to do with me?" I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes as Hammett let out an annoyed chirp at the sudden movement. "It's Fritz List," Joe said. The name acted like a bucket of ice water. List was a name on the list, a director with enough influence to move mountains at the studios. I hung up, dialed Culver City, and got Mannix on the line. I didn't give him a choice. I told him it would be in his best interest to get down to the vacant field on the edge of the city before the vultures arrived. When we pulled up to the tall grass of the field, the air was already thick with the smell of death and heat. But we weren't prepared for the staging. List lay nude in the dirt, his body a map of brutalization. His tongue had been jaggedly removed and carved deep into his chest. Post-mortem, from the look of the edges, was a swastika and the words, "Nazi fag." Eddie Mannix arrived, looking at the scene with a face that turned ashen under his tan. He immediately started barking orders at his studio fixers, trying to spin the narrative before the ink could dry on a reporter's notepad. He was already talking about unfortunate accidents or robberies gone wrong. But even for the fixer, this was going to be a hard story to scrub clean. As the boys in blue started bagging evidence, and Eddie paced the perimeter of the field, I caught him by the arm. "Eddie, we need to talk about the Rogers file," I said, my voice low so Joe wouldn't overhear. I spent the night at the station looking at the official version. It's a fairy tale. Mannix glared at me, his jaw set. "I told you, Jack, that's buried." "Not anymore." Fritz List is lying in the dirt with his tongue missing and a fucking swastika carved into his ribs. I believe there's a direct line between what happened to Lily in the 30s and the names on this list. If you don't give me the real files, the ones in your safe, the next body in a field might be someone you actually care about. The evening fog was rolling in off the coast, thick and heavy, as I pulled into the MGM lot. The newsboys were already screaming about the studio horror in the afternoon editions, but the real story was sitting in a manila stack on Eddie Mannix's desk. I spent the next 4 hours buried in the private records of the fixer. These weren't the sanitized reports I'd seen at the station. These were the raw notes, the payoff receipts, and the whispered confessions that kept the dream factory running. I was looking for a bridge between the 1932 extortion and the blood in the field today. One name was the constant: Bernie, the Lips Solomon. As Lily's manager, his presence wasn't a shock, but the frequency was. He was there at every meeting, every payoff, and every rehabilitation session the studio forced on her. I started to wonder if their bond was more than just a contract. Was he her protector, or was he the one holding the leash? The files noted that Lily's behavioral problems, the drinking, the late-night disappearances, only started after the studio saved her from the Stag film scandal. It didn't make sense. Usually, a starlet is grateful when the studio keeps her name out of the gutter. Unless, of course, she was in on the original play, hoping for a payday that Mannix's muscle made sure never arrived. "What do you really know about the Lip?" I asked, looking up as Mannix paced the office like a caged tiger. "He's a ghost from the silent days," Eddie grunted, not looking at me. "Used to be an assistant director over at Universal. He did a brief stint here at MGM, something on a Lon Chaney picture, before he decided there was more money in human cattle. He's a real son of a bitch, Jack. He's known for holding out for ridiculous contracts, playing the studios against each other until everyone's bleeding." I thought about the body in the field. Fritz List had been the director on Lily's last big MGM picture before she was sent to Poverty Row. Now he was nude in the dirt, his tongue cut out and a swastika carved into his skin. The manner of death was a message, I said, more to myself than to Eddie. Cutting out the tongue? That's for someone who talked too much, or someone they wanted to make sure never talked again. And the Nazi branding? List was a known degenerate, but a Nazi? In this town, that's a death sentence even before the gun goes off. The case was shifting. It wasn't just about a list of deviants anymore. It was about a long-buried secret that was finally clawing its way out of the Hollywood soil. "I need to see Lily," I said, standing up and grabbing my coat. "I think the Lip isn't just managing her career. I think he's managing her silence." Lily, not with the image of Fritz List's mangled corpse in my head. I needed a fresh shirt, a splash of cold water, and the grounding silence of the cat. As I stepped out of the DeSoto, the familiar black sedan belonging to Pandolini's crew pulled in behind me like a shadow. "Boss needs to see you," Dogface said, leaning out the window. His voice was flat, but there was a flicker of urgency in his eyes. "Give me 10 minutes, I said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Unless you want to come up and watch me shave." They followed me up, but as I reached the landing, I didn't need a detective's badge to see the problem. The door frame was splintered. Someone had used a crowbar on the lock and hadn't been polite about it. The office was a graveyard of paper. Files were scattered like autumn leaves. The wastebasket had been kicked across the room, and my desk had been cleared with one violent sweep. My first thought wasn't for the records. I never kept the real evidence where a common thief could find it. It was for the cat. Hammett, I called out. He emerged from behind the radiator, walking with a stiff, guarded hitch in his step, as if a heavy boot had found his ribs while he was trying to defend the fort. My blood turned to ice. "Have a seat, boys," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Handsome, seemingly unfazed by the wreckage, pulled a cold chicken drumstick from a grease-stained paper bag. He looked at the cat, then at me, and offered a piece of the meat as a peace offering. Hammett sniffed it reluctantly, took the prize, and gave Handsome's pant leg a quick rub. The purr that followed was a low rumble, a truce, but a wary one. "We need to go to the compound," Dogface said. The boss didn't want to wait. I nodded. I knew the drill. The ride to the hills was quiet. When we arrived, Pandolini didn't waste time with pleasantries or cognac. He stood by the window, looking out over the sprawling city that he claimed as his own. "We've been tracking the names on that list you gave us, Jack," Pandolini said, turning around. "We've used persuasive measures. Every lead, every terrified whisper, and every trail of dirty money leads back to one person, Lily Rogers. We just haven't figured out if she's the one pulling the strings or if she's the bait in the trap." Before I could respond, the phone on his desk let out a sharp ring. Pandolini answered, listened for a moment, and a grim smile touched his lips. "It's Jimmy Four Eyes Valgus," he told me, referring to a low-level lookout whose glasses were so thick they made his eyes look like dinner plates. "He's at a dive bar near MacArthur Park. It seems a loudmouth has been bragging about a job he did today. He claims a big shot promised him a career in the pictures if he ransacked a certain detective's office." Pandolini's eyes locked onto mine. "Keep him there," he barked into the receiver. He hung up and nodded toward Handsome and Dogface. "Go with Jack. Find out who this big shot is. And Jack, make sure he remembers why he shouldn't fuck with things that don't belong to him." The smell of the dive bar was a cocktail of spilled beer, sawdust, and the kind of heavy, unwashed atmosphere that only lives in places where people go to get lost. As we stepped through the door, the room dipped into a momentary silence, the kind of silence that follows a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The bar owner, a man whose face was a roadmap of the Prohibition era and who clearly remembered the weight of Pandolini's payroll, moved faster than a man his age should. He intercepted us before we were 3 steps in, his hands up in a silent prayer. He knew the look on Handsome and Dogface faces. It was the look of an audit that ended in a shallow grave. "Please," he hissed, his eyes darting toward his polished mahogany. "Not in the bar. I just had the floors waxed. Don't get blood on the wood." "We're just here for a conversation," Dogface said, his voice like gravel under a boot. "We'll take the air outside." Jimmy Four Eyes Valgus drifted over, his spectacles magnifying his eyes into twin moons of anxiety. He didn't say a word, just cut his eyes toward the back of the room. There, leaning against a scarred table, was a man who looked like he'd been dressed by a blind tailor in a hurry. He was loud, his face flushed with cheap bourbon, and he was peeling bills off a roll thick enough to choke a horse, tossing them around like they were play money. "That's him," Jimmy whispered. Handsome put a hand on my chest, stopping me. "Hold back, Jack. You're the face people remember. We're just the furniture. We'll go retrieve him." I watched them move, 2 predators navigating a watering hole. They didn't draw their heaters. They didn't shout. They just materialized on either side of the loudmouth. I couldn't hear what Handsome whispered into the man's ear, but the effect was instantaneous. The color drained from the drunk's face, turning him the shade of a week-old corpse. His boastful grin didn't just fade. It collapsed. Dogface reached into the man's breast pocket, his fingers coming out with the rest of the wad. With a theatrical flourish, he tossed the cash into the ceiling fan. "Drinks are on him," Dogface barked. The bar erupted. Patrons who had been nursing lukewarm drafts a moment ago were suddenly on their hands and knees, scrambling for the green confetti raining from the sky. In the chaos of the gold rush, no one noticed as Handsome and Dogface each took an arm, lifting the man off his feet. They marched him out the back door like they were helping a sick friend. By the time I reached the alley, the trunk of the black sedan was already open. They tossed him inside, a heap of cheap soot and terror, and slammed the lid shut. The man who had kicked Hammett was now in a dark, confined space, and we were a long way from a police station. "Where to, Jack?" Handsome asked, dusting off his hands. "Back to the cellar. Or do you want to find a quiet spot in the canyon where the coyotes can listen in?" "I know a spot nearby," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet alley. "An old army buddy owns a garage down the street, and he don't ask questions." I led the way, the black sedan crawling behind me like a shark in shallow water. I knocked on the heavy bay door of the shop. After a moment, a small side door creaked open, and Polly stood there, squinting through the dim light of a single bulb. "Jack, do you know what time it is?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Sorry for the late call, Polly. I need to use the garage for a bit." Polly looked past me at the sedan and the two shadows sitting in the front seat. He'd seen enough in the service to know when to look away. "The door is unlocked, but if you make a mess, you clean it up. I don't need the missus finding a crime scene in the morning." "Thanks, Polly." We dragged the man out of the trunk. He was shivering now, the bravado he'd displayed at the bar having leaked out of him somewhere between MacArthur Park and the garage floor. We tossed him under the harsh glow of a hanging work light. "Who hired you?" I asked, looming over him. "I never got a name," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Dogface. "Just that he is some hotshot manager. Promised me work in movies if I did the job." I looked at his greasy hair and the desperate lines on his face. "With that ugly mug." I chuckled. "There is nothing wrong with my face," the man exclaimed, a strange flash of vanity flickering through his terror. Dogface leaned in, his shadow swallowing the manhole. "That depends on how the night goes." The man broke. He confessed that the job wasn't about stealing. It was about the message. He was sent to show me that they knew where I lived, that the sanctuary of my office meant nothing. He was supposed to scare me into calling off the investigation. All I could think of was Bernie, the Lip Solomon. It had to be. Eddie Mannix was a lot of things, a liar, a fixer, a manipulator, but he wasn't a backstabber. Not to me. Not if he wanted to keep the wheels of MGM greased without the police throwing a wrench in them. I stepped closer, my shadow crossing over the man's chest. "What about my cat? Did he tell you to do that as well?" "The cat? That mangy thing." The man spat on the concrete. "That was all me. He tried to attack me, so I kicked him." "Yeah," Handsome said, leaning against a workbench and picking his teeth. "He does that." I leaned in so close I could smell the stale bourbon on his breath. "I have a message I want you to deliver. You tell that rat bastard I'm glad he knows where I live. Tell him I'll be waiting for him." Before he could answer, I moved. I knocked him to the ground with a sweep of my arm and followed it with a kick to the ribs, delivered with every ounce of the rage I'd been bottling since I saw Hammett limping. The sound of the bones cracking was wet and sharp in the quiet garage. "That's for the cat," I growled. We hauled his broken frame back into the black sedan and drove him back to the alley behind the dive bar. We dumped him near the trash bins, a heap of bruised ego and fractured ribs. Dogface stood over him for a second, adjusting his hat. "If you wouldn't talk so big, you wouldn't get into bar fights." "Understood." The man didn't speak. He just nodded in agreement through shallow, wheezing breaths, his eyes fixed on the pavement. I watched the taillights of the black sedan disappear into the early morning fog. "Get some rest, boys," I had told them. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to need you on lookout. If things go sideways at Lily's, I don't want to be the only one holding a hand." I had a gut feeling the case was about to crack wide open. I just hoped the cracking wouldn't be my skull. I drove back to the office, the interior of the DeSoto smelling like adrenaline and old upholstery. The sanctuary was a wreck, but the silence was heavy. I spent an hour uprighting the furniture and gathering the scattered files, the graveyard of paper finally being put to rest. I found Hammett behind the radiator again. I picked him up, feeling the slight tension in his frame, and gently placed him on the bed. I stroked his fur, a rhythmic penance for the boot he'd taken, until the steady rumble of his purr finally pulled us both into a heavy, dreamless sleep. Again, the telephone acted like a gunshot. I fumbled for the receiver, my shoulders screaming in protest. "Yeah. Jack, get your ass to the station. Now." Joe's voice was like flint. The drive over was a blur of paranoia. Had he caught wind of the lines I'd crossed? The garage? The broken ribs in the alley? I walked into the precinct feeling like the floor was made of thin glass. "Joe, I need a private room," I said before he could speak. "And I need you to have a very open mind." We ducked into an interrogation room. the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and floor wax. I told him everything. I couldn't keep the man I had fought beside, the man I had killed with, in the dark. I didn't want that weight on my heart. I laid out the Deviant List, the fixer's private files, and the blood I'd left in Pandolini's basement. Joe didn't yell. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He just sat there, looking older than his years, staring at a crack in the plaster. "I'm tired, Jack," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm tired of the bullshit and I'm tired of the bodies. I just want this over with." I told him the plan. I was going to Lily's apartment tonight. Pandolini's men would be the shadows in the street, ready to move if Solomon or his muscle tried to close the book on me. Joe looked up, a spark of the old fire hitting his eyes. "I'm in. Joe, take the night off. You don't need this. It's not right to leave an old army buddy out of the action, Jack. Besides, you'll probably walk into a door without me." He leaned forward, his face dead serious. "But listen to me. If this goes south, we aren't just losing badges. We're looking at a cell in San Quentin. You sure about this?" I looked at my hands. They were steady. To put an end to this? It's a risk worth taking. That night, we talked Paulie into one more mission. He didn't like it, but he didn't say no. We met Handsome and Dogface back at my place to coordinate. The atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The mob boys weren't exactly thrilled to be sharing oxygen with a cop. "Tonight, I'm just an old soldier," Joe said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking for a friendship, just a common target. While we fleshed out the logistics, Hammett, the little traitor, decided to crawl into Handsome's lap and fall fast asleep. Handsome looked down at the snoring ball of fur, a strange softness in his eyes that didn't match the heater tucked into his waistband. "You're still a little bastard," he muttered, though he didn't move to get up. The plan was simple, or as simple as suicide missions get. I would go into Lily's apartment alone, playing the role of the wandering suitor who just happened to be in the neighborhood. Joe, Paulie, and the Pandolini crew would wait down the road in their respective cars, ready to turn the street into a war zone if I didn't come out. We gathered the hardware and the brass, the metallic clack of chambering rounds, the only music we needed. As we pulled into position a block away from the West Hollywood apartment, Joe looked at me through the dark. "Are you sure you don't want me to go in with you?" "I know a little blonde is scary, Joe," I joked, checking my reflection in the rearview. "But I think I can handle it." I walked up the path, the smell of night-blooming jasmine doing its best to hide the scent of the city. I knocked. Lily opened the door, dressed in something thin that left very little to the imagination. "I was starting to think you were never going to come see me," she said. She tried for a girly coo, but years of heavy smoking and hard liquor had turned her voice into a sultry rasp. "It's not nice to keep a girl waiting." I sat on her sofa, the springs groaning under my weight. I tried to bring up List, the field, the tongue, the message, but she danced around the subject like a pro. She didn't want to talk about ghosts. "If I remember right," she whispered, straddling me and locking those iceberg blue eyes onto mine. "That night at the club, I told you I want to fuck you." She reached into my pants and wrapped her hand around the shaft of my cock, her touch cold and practiced. And I'm a girl that gets what she wants. What followed wasn't lovemaking. There was no tenderness, no romance. It was primal, animalistic, a desperate collision of two people who knew the world was rotting around them. It was, without a doubt, the best I'd ever had, fueled by a strange, frantic energy that felt like an explosion. Once the lustful fire had burned out, she climbed off me, composed as if she'd just finished an award-winning scene on a metro soundstage. She got dressed and slipped out of the room. I was pulling my boots back on, my head still spinning, when she returned with 2 cocktails. "Have a drink with me, detective," she said, handing me a glass. "Then we can talk." I took a sip. It was cold, crisp, and hit the back of my throat with a sharp bite. As she started spinning tales of her glory days, the lights, the cameras, the men who used to worship her, the room began to tilt. A strange, heavy paralysis started in my toes and raced up my spine. I tried to stand, to reach for my gun, to scream for Joe, but my muscles had turned to lead. The last thing I saw was Lily's face, her blue eyes watching me with a cold, detached pity, and a grin I have only seen on the faces of people that get a sick thrill from harming others, pure sadism, before the whole world went pitch black. The darkness didn't break all at once. It peeled back in slow, agonizing layers, accompanied by a pounding rhythm behind my eyes that felt like a localized earthquake. My vision was a smear of gray and yellow, but the voice that cut through the haze was unmistakable. It was the nasal, grating drawl of Bernie, the lips Solomon. "I'm glad you could join us, Detective Morgan," Solomon said, his voice dripping with a theater manager's false warmth. "You were given many chances, Jack. Many warnings to back off. But you just couldn't do that, could you? You're the one. That made this personal," I muttered. The words tasted like copper and bile in my mouth. I blinked hard, fighting the chemical weight in my eyelids, desperately trying to force the world into focus. My arms were pinned. I shifted my weight and felt the rigid bite of hemp rope cutting into my wrists. Tied to a chair. The irony didn't escape me, the hunter sitting in the hot seat. As the blurry shapes sharpened, the reality of the room locked into place. We weren't in Lily's glamorous West Hollywood apartment anymore. This was a cavernous, run-down warehouse, the air thick with dust, mildew, and the sharp tang of industrial grease. But Solomon had redecorated. The space had been transformed into a twisted, makeshift film set. Huge studio lights hung from the rafters, heavy cameras sat on dollies, and boom mics hovered like mechanical vultures. It was an expensive setup, all paid for through the terror of the men on the Deviant List, funded by the systematic extortion of Hollywood's hidden elite. Solomon stepped closer, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. His breath hit me, a foul cocktail of cheap cigars and dog shit. "You need a mint, Bernie," I croaked, turning my head slightly. "Smells like you've been eating off the sidewalk." The lip didn't flinch. He just smiled, a thin, ugly parting of his lips. "Since you're so curious about my operation, Jack, I'm going to be a pal. I'm going to give you the chance to be the star of your own picture. Only thing is, you're not quite big enough for a solo franchise. No, you're going to star in the sequel to Dan Johnson." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a long, silver straight razor. The blade caught the harsh glare of a studio lamp with a clean, lethal flick. "You already had your audition," Solomon whispered, his eyes dancing. "Did you enjoy fucking my wife? She's really good with a blade as well, as you can attest. You've seen her work on that hick junkie." The puzzle pieces finally slammed together, the jagged edges drawing blood in my mind. "Since you're going to die here tonight anyway," Solomon continued, pacing the concrete floor like a director blocking a scene, "there's no harm in letting you know how beautiful the script really is. I know you've been sniffing around that extortion case, too. That was the opening act, orchestrated by me and Lily. Those cheap, soulless bastards at MGM never paid her what she was worth. They treated her like property. I'm going to get my revenge on that son of a bitch Mannix if it's the last thing I do." His face twisted, still visibly steamed that Eddie had thrown a wrench into his grand premiere. "What about List?" I asked, keeping him talking, feeling the ropes around my right wrist start to give just a fraction of an inch. List was to keep the little fairy quiet. Solomon spat, waving the razor casually. He was getting scared. The pressure was cracking him, and he was in this too deep. We couldn't afford a weak link. He turned back toward the dark edges of the set and motioned to a pair of heavy-set shadows waiting in the wings. "Well, let's not keep our star waiting. Take him over to the bed." One of the thugs stepped forward, his thick fingers fumbling with the knots to free my arm so they could move me. He was careless. He thought the junk Lily had slipped me still had my muscles paralyzed. He was wrong. The moment the rope went slack around my right wrist, I drove my fist forward with every ounce of leverage I could muster, catching him squarely in the groin. The man doubled over instantly, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he collapsed to his knees, coughing and cursing into the sawdust. "Jesus Christ!" Solomon yelled. He lunged forward, taking a wild, desperate swipe with the straight razor. The silver edge bit into my left cheek, a sharp, cold sting followed instantly by the masking warmth of blood trickling down my jaw. I didn't blink. I looked up at him through the curtain of red, letting an evil, feral smile spread across my face. "I'm going to cut your heart out, Solomon." In the deep shadows at the back of the warehouse, I could see Lily. She was standing by a vanity mirror under a vanity light, completely detached from the violence, calmly adjusting her makeup and getting ready for her big scene. Solomon wiped a splash of my blood from his sleeve, his hand trembling slightly despite his bravado. "You've already lost, Flatfoot. Look around you. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Just accept it. You may get me, Bernie, I said, my voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that echoed against the corrugated steel walls. But you, her, and every single miserable soul in this room is leaving here one of two ways. You're going to the jail, or you're going to the morgue. Solomon let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. Oh, do you think I'm not aware of your little arrangement? Do you think I don't know you're working with Pandolini? That old, decaying fossil? I'll take care of him when I'm done with you. This is my fucking town, Jack. Do you hear me? My town. I spat a mouthful of blood onto his polished leather shoes. You're a nobody, Bernie, I assured him, keeping my eyes locked onto his, stripping away every ounce of the Hollywood illusion he had built around himself. You've always been a nobody. After tonight, you won't even be a headline. You'll just be a forgotten piece of meat, rotting away in a cold, unmarked grave. Years from now, people will walk right over you, and they won't even bother to look down, because you are an absolute nobody. The roar of the engines outside was the only warning we got before the world came apart. The heavy corrugated metal doors of the warehouse didn't just open, they tore off their hinges with a scream of tortured steel. Joe, Polly, and Pandolini's boys rushed through the smoke like ghosts looking for a fight. Are we late for the party? Dogface snarled, his Tommy gun already raised. Then, the warehouse erupted. The deafening chatter of automatic fire and the sharp cracks of service pistols shattered the makeshift studio, turning Solomon's expensive cameras and hot lights into a hail of flying glass and splintered wood. Joe didn't waste time trading lead. He sprinted through the crossfire, staying low, and materialized beside my chair. In 3 swift motions, his army knife sliced through the hemp ropes pinning my arms. He hauled me to my feet, shoving a heavy .45 automatic into my right hand and pressing my own trench knife into my left. We have to take at least one of them in alive, Jack, Joe shouted over the din of screaming men and ricocheting bullets. Just to make this look even halfway good to the brass. I wiped a fresh smear of blood from my sliced cheek, my eyes locking onto the back of the set. Taken Rogers, I spat, the adrenaline masking the pain. She killed Dan Johnson. You were right from the start, Joe. A woman did it. Through the blinding haze of cordite smoke and spraying blood, I saw them bolt. Bernie and Lily didn't stand and fight for their town. They slipped through a rusted fire exit, vanishing into the pitch-black emptiness of the industrial field behind the warehouse. They're running, I yelled. Joe and I broke for the exit, leaving Polly and Pandolini's enforcers behind to finish the execution of Bernie's remaining crew. The sounds of the slaughter faded behind us as we hit the open night air. The field was a graveyard of weeds and hidden debris. We chased the shadows ahead of us under the pale, uncaring moonlight. Suddenly, Lily shrieked. Her heel caught the edge of a jagged trench, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop that sent her sprawling hard into the dirt. Joe was on her before she could scramble back up, the metallic clink of his regulation cuffs snapping around her wrists before she could even draw a breath. I didn't stop. My eyes were fixed on the frantic, stumbling shape of Bernie, the lip, Solomon further down the field. He turned as he ran, blindly firing his piece back at me. The muzzle flashes briefly illuminated his terrified, sweating face. I stopped, planted my feet, raised the .45, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy round caught Bernie square in the spine. He let out a sharp grunt, his legs giving out as he pitched forward into the dirt. But as he fell, his finger convulsed on his own trigger one last time. Bang! The white-hot lead tore directly into my belly. It didn't feel like a bullet. It felt like the thunder of God himself ripping through my insides, ripping through my flesh, and setting my abdomen on fire. The world tilted violently, and my knees hit the dirt. The pain was excruciating, a blinding white fog that threatened to drag me under, but the rage kept my hands moving. Bleeding out into the weeds, I dragged my useless legs behind me, carving a red trail through the dirt until I was hovering over Bernie's gasping form. I pressed the cold steel barrel of the pistol directly against his forehead. I pulled the trigger. Click. The mechanism jammed, choked on the grid of the field. Bernie looked up at me through the dark, a wet, pained laugh bubbling up through his teeth. What now, Flatfoot? He wheezed, his eyes rolling. Your toy broke. You gonna take me in now? No, I whispered. I dropped the useless gun, shifted my weight, and straddled his chest. I pulled the army knife from my boot. I'm a man of my word, Bernie. I drove the blade down, burying it deep into his chest until the hilt bit into his expensive wool suit, piercing his sadistic heart. I leaned in close, locking my eyes onto his beady little stares, watching the ugly light of his ambition finally fade into nothingness. Joe hurried up behind me, dragging a sobbing Lily by the arm. She wasn't crying for Bernie. She wasn't even crying for the murder charge. She was sobbing for the headlines, for what the rags and the papers would say when the illusion of the starlet was stripped away forever. It was the start of the end for her. Put her in the car, Joe. I grunted, my hand clamped tight over my leaking stomach. Give me a moment. Joe dropped Lily into the dirt for a second, his eyes widening as he noticed the dark, spreading stains soaking through my shirt. Jesus, Jack, the belly. We need to get you to the hospital right now. I looked back toward the city lights, the pain turning cold and numb. After we leave here, I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the wind. The cold night air began to feel heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressing down on my chest as the adrenaline finally started to evaporate. Joe didn't look back as he hauled Lily across the dark field. He marched her straight through the bullet-riddled warehouse, past the shattered glass and the bodies of Bernie's crew, forcing her into the back seat of his unmarked car. She was still whimpering, a broken record of ruined ambition, but the sound was fading. Back in the weeds, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I managed to push myself up, my hand still clamped over the burning hole in my stomach, and started a slow, agonizing march back toward the light. Every step felt like a rusty blade turning in my gut. Before I could collapse, a pair of heavy shoulders caught my weight. The boss has a doctor that owes him a favor and won't ask questions, Dogface said, easing my arm over his shoulder. His voice was still gravelly, but the rough edge was gone. Stay with us, pal, Handsome said, stepping in on my other side to share the load. For a guy who killed people for a living, his grip was steady and almost human, almost caring. By the time we navigated the debris and reached the pavement, Joe had already slammed his back door on Lily. Paulie was standing a few yards away, checking his watch and looking down the dark street. He wasn't lingering to admire the handiwork. I'm walking back down the block, Jack, Paulie muttered, lighting a cigarette with a steady hand to hide the fact that he'd just been in a war zone. Don't need to be seen if the local precinct decided to finally wake up. Not that I'm afraid of the badges. But if the missus finds out I was out here playing with my old army buddies at 3 in the morning, I will catch a brand of hell like I have never seen. He paused, looking back at the smoking doorway of the warehouse with a faint, crooked grin. But it was nice to get to see some action again, old friend. If you ever need me again, I'll be ready. Just don't tell the wife. I tried to laugh, but the gesture turned into a strained, choked gasp that sent a fresh wave of white-hot agony shooting straight up to my ribs. Go home, Paulie, I wheezed. Dogface and Handsome didn't waste any more time. They hoisted me into the back of Pandolini's sedan, sliding my leaking frame across the leather seat before jumping into the front. The engine roared to life, the tires screaming as Handsome threw the heavy car into gear and tore away from the curb, leaving the West Hollywood warehouse to burn in our rearview mirror. We were throwing sparks down Sunset Boulevard, the speedometer needle shaking against the glass, when the worst possible sound cut through the roar of the motor. A sharp siren wailed, and a pair of red and blue lights started flashing behind us, reflecting off the dark buildings. Oh shit, Handsome exclaimed, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. Normally, a guy like Handsome wouldn't think twice. He'd have slammed his foot to the floor, cut through the side streets of the canyon, and tried to lose them in the dark. But he didn't do that. He glanced in the rearview mirror at me, pale, sweating, and holding my bloody midsection. Over the last 24 hours, a quiet, ever-growing respect had passed between the hitman and myself. He knew a high-speed chase would likely bounce the remaining life out of me. With a curse, Handsome pulled the sedan over to the curb. The heavy footsteps of a uniform crunched against the gravel. The cop walked up to the driver's side, his hand resting casually on his holster. What's the hurry, fellas? It's an emergency, Handsome said, his voice remarkably smooth despite the situation. Our friend in the back needs a doctor. Fast. The officer grunted and flicked on his heavy flashlight, sweeping the beam across the front seat before washing the harsh light over the back seat. The glare hit my face, illuminating a bleeding, ghostly pale Jack Morgan. The cop froze, the flashlight trembling for a fraction of a second. "Jack? Is that you?" I blinked through the blinding light, recognizing the face under the cap, an old beat cop from the Wilshire division I'd shared more than a few nickel coffees with. "Yeah, it's me, Frank," I weakly replied, my voice barely a whisper against the upholstery. No time to explain. Frank didn't ask for registrations, and he didn't look at the muscle in the front seat too closely. He snapped his flashlight off and pointed toward the road ahead. "Well, I'll provide an escort to the hospital. When you are better, Jack, you can tell me what the hell happened over a cold one." He sprinted back to his cruiser. Within seconds, the siren was wailing a different tune, a clear path through the early morning traffic. Handsome jammed the gas pedal down, staying right on the cop's bumper as we flew through the red lights and onto the hospital ramp. The emergency doors flew open, and the staff didn't even wait for a gurney before they were hauling me out of the sedan. A gray-haired doctor took one look at the dark stains soaking through my trousers and the cold sweat on my forehead. "You're lucky you got here when you did, Detective," the doctor said, his voice calm but authoritative as they wheeled me down the bright, sterile hallway. He leaned in slightly, away from the nurses, and gave Dogface a brief nod. "But we will get you fixed up. Any friend of Mr. Pandolini is a friend of ours." As the heavy double doors of the operating room began to swing shut, the bright fluorescent lights started to spin, and the world finally slipped away, this time, into a clean, quiet dark. Before the nurses could wheel me through the double doors, I reached down with my free hand, ignoring the searing fire in my gut. I grabbed a piece of my own ruined, bloody shirt, wrapping it tightly around a raw trophy I'd taken in battle. I tied it into a crude, heavy sack and pressed it into Dogface's palm. "Wrap this in paper," I wheezed, the copper taste of blood heavy on my tongue. "Put it in a nice box, with a pretty ribbon on top. Give it to Pandolini in the morning." Dogface looked at the wet, crimson bundle, then up at me. A slow, grim nod of understanding, and a sadistic, knowing smile passed between us. "Consider it delivered, Jack." The hospital staff worked through the night under the harsh, sterile lights. The clinking of surgical steel and the quiet, urgent murmurs of the nurses played a distant background track to my unconsciousness. It turned out the angels were looking out for a cynical bastard like me. The slug had torn clean through my side, missing the vital organs by a fraction of an inch. I was leaking, and I was going to be sore until the next decade, but I was alive. When I finally opened my eyes, the blinding white glare of the morning sun was cutting through the window blinds of a private room. The smell of antiseptic was combating something heavy and fragrant. Joe was sitting in a vinyl chair by the bedside, his coat thrown over the back, looking like he'd aged 5 years, but wearing a look of profound relief. On the bedside table sat a massive, borderline ridiculous arrangement of expensive flowers. Tucked into the cellophane was a small card that simply read, "From Mr. Pandolini. Look who decided to rejoin the living," Joe said, a tired smile breaking through his stubble. "Did you get her?" I croaked, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. Joe leaned back, nodding. "Rogers was formally charged with the murder of Dan Johnson this morning. The chief is having a fit about our methods, the files, the warehouse looking like a butcher shop, but he loves the results. A high-profile Hollywood case closed in under 72 hours makes the department look like heroes." Of course, Joe paused, his eyes dancing with a quiet, dangerous amusement. "The chief doesn't need to know everything that happened out in those weeds." Though every muscle in my abdomen screamed in protest, I managed to let out a weak, genuine smile. "No, you're certainly right about that." I looked over at the flowers, my mind drifting back to the hills, to the grand estate overlooking the sprawling, corrupt city. I imagined that right about now, Pandolini was sitting down at his polished mahogany desk, a cup of black espresso in hand. I could see him untying a pretty ribbon, peeling back the crisp wrapping paper, and opening a nice box. Inside would be the stiff, dried piece of my bloody shirt. And inside that cloth would be the testicles of the man who had gotten Pandolini's beloved niece killed. It wasn't the kind of gift you found at a department store, but in our world, it was the highest form of respect. I imagined a rare, genuine smile finally crossing the face of Don Pandolini, my ally. Joe stood up, adjusting his holster and looking down at me with the quiet warmth of a man I'd gone to hell and back with. The doctors say you're grounded here for at least a few days, Jack. Is there anything I can do for you before I head back to the precinct to start filling out a mountain of paperwork? I closed my eyes, the exhaustion of the war finally settling deep into my bones, thinking of the quiet, wrecked sanctuary on the boulevard where a small, stubborn survivor was waiting patiently for me. Feed Hammett for me. I would greatly appreciate it, my old friend, I said. The white walls of the hospital were starting to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. I was sitting on the edge of the mattress, gingerly easing into a clean shirt Joe had brought over, when the heavy oak door clicked open. I expected a nurse with a clipboard, or maybe Joe with my discharge papers. Instead, the doorway was filled by the immaculate, iron-gray presence of Eddie Mannix. The MGM fixer stepped into the sterile room, his tailored suit completely out of place against the linoleum. He didn't have flowers, and he didn't look like he'd lost a single minute of sleep. "You look like hell, Jack," he said, closing the door firmly behind him. "You should see the other guy, Eddie," I croaked, my side still giving a sharp, rhythmic throb beneath the fresh bandages. Mannix walked over to the window, peering through the blinds at the sunny L.A. streets below. Word travels fast when a West Hollywood warehouse gets turned into a shooting gallery. The papers are calling it a tragic lover's quarrel gone wrong between Solomon and Lily Rogers. They say Bernie bit it in a frantic escape attempt. I let out a dry, careful breath. Lily and the Lip were the masterminds behind the 32 extortion case all along. The file you gave me, the man we got rid of, that poor bastard that left a brown streak all the way out of town, was just a pawn hired to take the fall for them so they could clear their tracks. Lily played the victim, Bernie pulled the strings, and the studio took the bait. Mannix didn't look surprised. In his line of work, the truth was just something you polished until it fit the studio's narrative. He turned around, fixing me with a heavy, calculating stare. "Again, Jack, the offer stands. Come work for me at Metro. A guy with your instincts shouldn't be bleeding out in industrial fields for a handful of loose change. It will be a bit safer than this." I looked at the small card from Pandolini sitting on the empty nightstand, then back at the corporate titan standing before me. I knew what the studio was, but I also knew the city was changing. The gutter wars were getting louder. "I won't wear your collar, Eddie," I said, adjusting my belt with a grimace. "But I'll take the work, on a case-by-case basis. You find a ghost you can't scrub away, you call my office." Mannix offered a tight, professional nod, a contract sealed without ink. "Fair enough, detective. Get some rest." An hour later, the hospital doors swung open, and I stepped out into the blinding California sun. I expected to flag down a yellow cab, but idling right at the curb was a gleaming, midnight black Cadillac. The rear door flew open before my boots hit the pavement. Dogface and Handsome stepped out, their heavy frames immediately blocking the sun. Instead of the cold, lethal stares they usually gave the world, they greeted me with rough, brotherly hugs that almost put me back on the operating table. "Easy, boys," I gasped, wincing as my stitches protested, still holding the plumbing together. "Good to see you up and walking, Jack," Dogface said, a rare, knowing warmness breaking through his battered face. I piled into the back of the luxury sedan, the interior smelling of expensive leather and Pandolini's preferred brand of imported tobacco. As Handsome threw the car into gear, Dogface leaned over, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Boss wanted me to tell you he wishes he could have nailed the bastard personally. But he really liked your gift. Said it was the most honest piece of bookkeeping he's seen in years." I smiled, looking out at the palm trees rolling past. The receipt had been stamped. The debt for Pandolini's niece was cleared, and Jack Morgan was officially a protected name in this town. They pulled up to the curb on the boulevard, the engine purring like a well-fed predator. As I opened the door, Handsome looked back through the rearview mirror. "You make sure you come visit the estate once you've settled in and rested up, Flatfoot." "You had better," Dogface added with a smirk. "Remember what happened the first time you kept the Dawn waiting?" I rubbed the back of my head, a phantom ache hitting the spot where Handsome's blackjack had introduced itself to my skull the night I met these two. "How could I forget?" I muttered. They flashed a pair of grim smiles, slammed the doors, and melted back into the midday traffic. I stood on the pavement for a long minute, just breathing in the exhaust, the hot asphalt, and the distant salty air of the Pacific Ocean. I walked into the building, my boots heavy on the stairs, preparing myself for the wreckage I'd left behind after Bernie's thugs had torn my life apart. But when I turned the key and pushed the door open, I froze. The lock had been completely replaced, the heavy wood reinforced. The broken glass was gone. The shattered files had been neatly cataloged and returned to a brand new cabinet, and the desk had been polished until I could see my own tired reflection in the wood. Pandolini's crew didn't just deliver boxes. They cleaned up after their own. Before I could even close the door behind me, a black streak roared out from beneath the radiator. Hammett didn't hesitate. The little bastard launched himself straight into the air, climbing up my trousers and my wool jacket like a pine tree, perching his heavy frame right on my good shoulder like a cross-eyed parrot. "Easy, pal, easy," I groaned, leaning against the doorframe as his claws dug through the fabric. I'm still sore. He didn't care. He just rubbed his wet nose against my cheek, his body vibrating with a frantic energy. I walked over to the small kitchenette, carefully pouring out a fresh bowl of water and dumping a generous helping of food into his dish. He hopped down, inhaling the meal like he hadn't seen food in a century, though the empty cans in the bin told me Joe had kept his word. I dragged my battered bones over to the big leather chair behind the desk and collapsed into the cushions. The springs gave their familiar, welcoming groan. For the first time in what seems like an eternity, the knot in my chest completely unraveled. I was home. The sanctuary was intact. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a Camel, and flicked my lighter. I took a deep, dragging hit, filling my lungs with the satisfying, smoky bite of tobacco. As the blue smoke drifted toward the ceiling, a heavy weight landed softly on my lap. Hammett turned in two tight circles, dug his front paws into my thigh to find the sweet spot, and curled into a tight ball. He looked up at me, his green eyes steady, unblinking, and carrying a look that said everything the rest of the city couldn't. "I've missed you." I rested my hand on his warm fur, the steady, rhythmic engine of his purr vibrating against my palms. Outside, the sirens were wailing down the boulevard, and the neon lights of Hollywood were getting ready to blink awake, ready to blind the next batch of rubes. But inside the office, the dark was clean, the debts were paid, and the shadows were finally at peace. The morning sun hadn't quite burned the haze off the city streets when I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct. The familiar, comforting scent of floor wax, spilled ink, and stale coffee hit me, a sharp contrast to the sterile white walls I'd spent the last few days staring at. I was making a slow, cautious beeline toward Joe's desk, my hand instinctively resting near my bandaged midsection, when a loud, grating voice cut through the bullpen chatter. "You coming in to beg for your job back, Morgan?" Murphy called out from across the room, a smug, sarcastic grin plastered across his face for the benefit of the surrounding uniforms. I paused, leaning slightly against a filing cabinet to take the pressure off my side, and fixed him with a cold, deadpan stare. "If I do, Murphy, I'm going to request you as my partner. That way, next time I'm in a tight spot, I can use you as a human shield." A few of the beat cops chuckled, and Murphy's grin soured instantly. I kept moving, dropping into the wooden chair beside Joe's desk with a sharp, involuntary hiss as my stitches pulled. "You look better upright," Joe said, looking up from a mountain of paperwork. "I feel like a discarded rug, but the plumbing's holding," I muttered. I leaned forward, my voice dropping. "Thanks for taking care of the cat, Joe. I mean it. The little bastard didn't starve." "Don't mention it." Joe smiled, capping his fountain pen. "But if I ever have to smell open tins of salmon in my apartment again, I'm charging you hazard pay. Now go see the old man. He's been pacing his office waiting for you." I hauled myself up and walked into the chief's office, the frosted glass door shutting out the noise of the bullpen. The chief didn't offer me a seat. He just stared at me over a thick manila folder, his jaw set hard. "With the Wild West Cowboys stunts you and Russo pulled out at that warehouse, Jack, you are damn lucky you aren't sitting in a cell in San Quentin right now," he growled, slamming the folder shut. "Or paying me for the property damage." "Results, Chief," I said flatly, leaning against his desk. "Lily Rogers is signed, sealed, and delivered for the Dan Johnson murder. The papers are happy. The sharks and the gossip rags got their pound of flesh. The mayor is happy, and your precinct looks like Scotland Yard. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute, grinding his teeth. Then, with a heavy, reluctant sigh, he opened his middle drawer, pulled out his checkbook, and furiously scribbled a line of ink. He ripped the voucher out and slapped it onto the blotter. "Get the hell out of my sight, Morgan, before I remember I'm a lawman." I snatched the check, flashing a big smart-ass grin. Always a pleasure doing business with the city. With money finally burning a hole in my pocket, my stomach gave a loud, angry rumble. The hospital gruel hadn't been worth the spoon they served it with, and my insides were demanding something solid. I walked down the block, the midday heat rising from the pavement, and stepped into the cool, familiar grease-stained sanctuary of the diner. "Ham and eggs, Rose, dear," I called out, finding my usual spot at the counter. Rose turned around from the grill, a spatula in her hand, her eyes sweeping over my battered face and the cautious, stiff way I was moving. "You look like hell, Jack," she said, her voice carrying that sharp, no-nonsense warmth. "I've been through it, Rosie," I replied, suppressing a groan as I gingerly slid onto the vinyl stool. Getting into the seat wasn't nearly as easy as it used to be. She set down a steaming plate of thick-cut ham, perfectly runny eggs, and a mug of black coffee that smelled like salvation. I inhaled the food like a condemned man, trading playful, easy banter with her between bites, letting the familiar rhythm of her sharp wit wash away the lingering grit of the field and the warehouse. But as I finished the last corner of toast, the humor faded. I set my fork down, suddenly getting very quiet. I looked down at the counter, my knuckles tightening around the coffee mug. Rose noticed the shift instantly. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaning over the counter, her expression softening. "What's wrong, Jack?" My chest felt tight, tighter than it had when Solomon was waving that straight razor in my face. I swallowed hard, finally gathering up every ounce of nerve I had left in my scarred body. I looked up, meeting her eyes. "I have a question for you, Rose." "I'm listening," she said softly. "Would you like to go out sometime? With me? A real date?" Rose stared at me for a beat, a slow, beautiful smile breaking across her face. She let out a soft laugh that made the whole room feel a little lighter. "What took you so long, detective? I was starting to think you didn't like me." I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling a sudden, ridiculous flush of heat. "I guess I was just afraid a beautiful girl like you wouldn't want to be seen on the arm of a broken-down, cynical detective." The playfulness left her face, replaced by something steady and warm. She reached across the marble counter, taking my rough, calloused hand in hers, squeezing it gently. She looked me dead in the eyes, her smile turning entirely affectionate. "Some detective," she whispered,